Chapter 782, The Invisible Empire Arrives. Ethan stepped into the Great Hall of the Invisible Empire's palace, where colossal ice pillars soared from the glacier's heart like natural skyscrapers. Each spire rose tens of meters into the air, straight, unyielding, and strong enough to uphold the immense weight of the structure above. Delicate patterns of ice blossoms were etched into their surfaces as if nature herself, an artisan of unparalleled skill, had carved every petal and tendril. When the light struck these carvings, they glittered with an icy brilliance, like countless diamonds set into each towering column. The frozen motifs were both intricate and enchanting. Some resembled flowers in full bloom, others drifted like snowflakes captured mid-fall, and still others flowed with the gentle curves of a mountain stream. Together they wove a single, sweeping tapestry that filled the palace's pristine white expanse with a sense of mystery and wonder. At the center of the hall stood a throne hewn from a single, massive block of ice. Its form was imposing and austere, seemingly as immovable as the mountain from which it was quarried. Yet its contours were smooth and graceful, a testament to artistry shaped by ice rather than stone. Beyond these soaring pillars and the crystalline throne, the hall lay uncluttered and serene, every detail stripped away so that the palace's pure, frozen beauty could stand alone in silent majesty. The chamber's floor is laid with a unique variety of ice crystals, tough and abrasion-resistant, yet glowing softly from within. Their pale light makes the vast space feel even more expansive. All around, the walls and ceiling are hewn from ice, their surfaces intricately carved with symbols and inscriptions. Each pattern and word holds deep meaning, embodying the culture and beliefs of the Quincy. The simple, unadorned design lends the hall a profound solemnity, as though the very stones, or in this case the very ice, demand reverence. The air itself seems frozen in stillness. Visitors instinctively hold their breath, wary of disturbing the hallowed quiet. At the far end of the chamber stands a throne, and upon it sits Ethan, draped in a flowing crimson robe. One hand props his cheek as he leans slightly to the side, eyes closed in deep contemplation. His long black hair frames a thick beard that falls to his chest like a dark waterfall, lending him an aura of both majesty and mystery. Though his features are at rest, the firm set of his jaw and the faint furrow of his brow betray the weighty thoughts occupying his mind. On the open collar of his robe, 3 silver medals catch the light, their gleam announcing his rank and authority to anyone who enters. Yhwach's stern gaze, his regal robes, and his unwavering bearing combine to project an aura of untouchable majesty. As the supreme ruler of the Invisible Empire, and the very founder of the Quincy, he filled the grand throne room with solemnity and reverence. For a long moment, his eyes remained closed. Then, without warning, they snapped open, revealing a cold, penetrating light that seemed capable of slicing through flesh and spirit alike. His deep voice rolled through the hall like distant thunder. Hashwald! At the summons, a tall aristocratic man with flowing golden hair stepped forward. In precise, respectful motion, he sank to one knee before the throne. "Your Majesty," Hashwald intoned, "how may I serve?" He was Yhwach's most trusted lieutenant, the one charged with carrying out the king's will. Yhwach's reply was calm but resolute. "Inform every division that the decisive battle has begun. Prepare to invade the Soul Society." There was no doubt in his tone. Yhwach had seen the future, the ruin of the Soul Society and the rise of the Invisible Empire. "Yes, Your Majesty," Hashwald replied, bowing his head once more. With that, he rose and turned, striding swiftly from the throne room. The command must reach every corner of the empire at once. Victory hung on their readiness. The plan has changed, and there's no time to die the Reaper. Yhwach lingered in the depths of his palace, speaking the words under his breath. His whisper reverberated along the stone walls of the empty hall. In his eyes flickered a contradictory blend of ambition and anxiety, the hunger for triumph locked in a silent struggle with unease over what tomorrow might bring. He turned and strode toward the balcony, pressing himself against the low battlement. Below him lay the Invisible Empire, vast and motionless as a midnight sea. Buildings formed from pure spirit particles glowed like distant stars against the surrounding darkness. Every street, every courtyard throbbed with the Quincy's iron will and fading hopes of conquest. A fierce pride swelled in Yohabak's chest. He envisioned the instant when the entire world would bow to him, when all life would bend beneath his sovereignty. This realm was no mere earthly kingdom. It was a meticulously crafted spirit space, the culmination of thousands of years of Quincy research and innovation. Though it occupied the same latitude and longitude as the Seirete, the two worlds coexisted like parallel lines, eternally adjacent yet never truly touching. Yohabak closed his eyes. The next move would be decisive, and there was no room left for delay. The Quincy, long thought to be the Soul King's natural adversaries, have returned after a millennium of absence, bearing with them the invisible empire and a burning thirst for vengeance. Their knowledge of the Seirete runs deeper than bone. Every wall, every sentry post, every secret passage is as familiar to them as the blood in their veins. Even the soul-suppressing barrier that shields the Seirete is no longer an insurmountable obstacle. At the very heart of this invisible empire sits Yewak, the God King, upon a throne that embodies his absolute rule. His eyes are cold and fathomless, as if they could see through every illusion and pierce every hidden corner of the Seirete. He watches the Shinigami scurry about their duties, oblivious to the storm gathering at their gates, still savoring a momentary peace they can no longer afford. Their fates have already been written, and calamity draws near. God King, Ewok whispers to himself. Then, with measured confidence, he rises and strides from the grand hall. Each step echoes the certainty of a ruler who knows nothing, and no one can stand in his way. No one could stand in Ethan's way. Anyone who tried became little more than a fleeting diversion in his relentless march toward world domination. The Soul Society, the once mighty realm of the death gods, now teetered on the brink of total collapse, unaware of the true storm gathering at its gates. After 1,000 years of silence, the Quincy, natural enemies of the death gods, had returned, reigniting a war no one had truly thought over. Their comeback was anything but quiet. From every corner, dark tendrils unfurled like invisible claws slicing through the night, silently devouring the land of the Soul Society. These shadows weren't solid shapes, but swirling concentrations of spiritual particles, energy masses that oozed upward from the ground, consuming all before them at terrifying speed. Even the sturdy wooden barracks of the Soul Society proved no match for their power. What had once looked impregnable splintered and collapsed as spirit energy ate away at every beam and plank, as if an unseen hand shattered them from within. In their place rose stark white towers with sharply pointed roofs, their European-inspired spires piercing the sky in stark contrast to the encroaching darkness. They stood motionless as solid ice encrusted every corner of the buildings, lending the scene a cold, awe-inspiring grandeur. Chapter 783, Killing. A profound change rippled through Seirete, not just in its buildings, but in the transparent soul-shielding barrier that encircled the entire realm. What had once been a gleaming protective dome, a beacon of safety for every soul reaper within, now lay cloaked in absolute blackness, as if a piece of the void itself had swallowed it whole. All light from the sky vanished, and Seirete was plunged into uncanny darkness. When the shadow finally lifted, the gathered soul reapers stared in stunned silence. Their beloved Seirete had vanished. In its place towered a massive frozen palace, its walls sheathed in ice that glinted with an eerie, lifeless brilliance. Jagged battlements crowned its ramparts, and an aura of death and despair hung in the frigid air. A bone-deep chill snaked through the courtyards, causing even the bravest to shiver. "How is this possible?" Death God Shishio murmured, voice trembling. His normally stern features were drawn with horror and confusion. "Seirete, it's gone." Lieutenant Kaneko's voice was hollow, as though he were speaking of some distant dream rather than the ruin before him. His words carried the weight of utter hopelessness. "Did an enemy do this?" a young soul reaper demanded, stepping forward. His tone quivered with fear, but his spirit flared with defiance. Around them, the silent gates of the ice palace stood like a waiting maw, cold, unyielding, and ready to consume any who dared to challenge its deadly dominion. Ethan's eyes burned with a determined light, as if he were searching the darkness for a single spark of hope. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low and strained. An experienced Shinigami stepped forward and shook his head. "By all signs, we're under attack, by some power we've never encountered before. A heavy silence fell over the gathered reapers. Morale had already plummeted at the inexplicable disappearance of Seirete, and now their once unshakable convictions wavered under the weight of fear. Unease rippled through their ranks, but they knew they couldn't afford to surrender. The war had begun, and they would defend their world, whatever the cost. Without warning, the earth beneath them shuddered violently, as though a colossal force stirred far below the surface. In an instant, dozens of towering pillars of green spiritual fire burst upward. The flames flickered with an otherworldly blend of hellish fury and celestial lightning, stabbing into the sky like emerald lances. Their brilliance rivaled noonday sun, banishing the surrounding gloom in a wash of emerald light. Waves of searing heat rippled outward, warping the air and twisting every shape into a mirage. In that moment, as the pillars crackled with raw power, Ethan realized the real battle was only just beginning. Ethan watched in awe as the spirit particles in the Soul Society's air rallied around the towering pillars of fire. The sheer concentration of spiritual energy kept the flames blazing without falter, and with every flicker, they grew more fierce. Electric blue tongues of fire danced against the night sky, each leap sending waves of searing heat outward. Any death god who ventured too close was instantly vaporized. Their forms disintegrated in the inferno, leaving nothing but a whisper of ash on the wind. Those who managed to dodge the worst of it were not so fortunate. Gravely wounded, they collapsed to the stone courtyard, writhing in agony. The power on display defied description. It felt as though the entire Seirete might be consumed in an instant. In the face of such devastation, the death gods scrambled backward, retreating from the relentless blaze. They could only watch, helpless, as their comrades were swallowed by the flames, grief and fury twisting in their hearts. Ethan understood then that this was no longer a simple skirmish over territory or honor. It had become a fight for the very survival of the Soul Society. If the source of this enemy power isn't located and destroyed soon, the Seirete itself will be lost. Captain Yamamoto recognized this instantly. Fully aware of the stakes, he gave a single, uncompromising order: slay every intruder. Like a crack of thunder across the night sky, that command electrified the Seirete. Every Shinigami on watch stiffened with resolve, their blades ready to strike. Far below, in the heart of the invisible empire, Chief Assistant Hugolin Hasward stood on a high dais behind heavy draperies. His unblinking eyes pierced the gloom to survey the distant, war-ravaged field. He showed no emotion, an alabaster statue carved in human form. But when he spoke, his voice rumbled through the chamber like a gathering storm. As one of the highest-ranking officers of the Knights of the Star Cross, Hasward combined immense power with an unyielding, ice-cold will. His sacred seal, the word of binding B, was said to restore harmony to the world. Yet in this conflict, he intended to wield that very power to shatter the world's balance. Ethan spread his arms slowly, as if embracing the entire world, and his deep, commanding voice rolled through the empty hall. By His Majesty's decree, annihilate every last enemy soldier. His words crackled with determination and authority, an irresistible mandate that pressed down on every soul in the invisible empire. Heads bowed in unison as they swore fealty to Ethan's command. No sooner had the Emperor spoken than the 16 Star-Crossed Knights sprang into action. Clad in white cloaks, they slipped through the shadows like ghosts, some posted in alcoves along the cold stone walls, others standing sentinel in the vast chamber. With the sole exceptions of those marching toward the Divine Realm and Soul City, and the hunting parties bound for Hueco Mundo, every available force gathered here. Then, with a collective motion, the knights sprang skyward, employing the Quincy's exclusive footwork to hover and dart through the air. Like a flock of hawks unleashed, they streaked toward the one spot where spiritual pressure roared the loudest. That is, where the Shinigami had assembled. Ordinary Shinigami are typically tasked with confronting the holy soldiers of the Invisible Empire, a force whose sole mission is to eradicate their enemies without hesitation. Blessed with potent spiritual power and exceptional combat training, these soldiers can overwhelm rank-and-file death gods with ease. Yet, when it comes to Seirete's captain-class officers, the holy soldiers are truly tested. Enter the stern Cross Knights, an elite Quincy cadre charged expressly with hunting down and slaying those captains. Each knight commands a distinctive ability and invokes sacred spells capable of unleashing devastating force. In the Quincy hierarchy, they stand like kings among cheetahs, predators who single out the mightiest prey and bring them down one by one. Faced with such adversaries, ordinary Shinigami often find themselves outmatched. Even their considerable spiritual pressure and swordsmanship fall short once they lose the terrain advantage or are lured into the Quincy's meticulously laid traps. But just when all seems lost, the captains of Seirete arrive like lighthouses piercing a stormy night. With their unparalleled strength, unwavering resolve, and hard-won battle experience, they rally the rank-and-file Shinigami and mount a decisive counterattack, turning the tide of battle in an instant. For a time, the battlefield was ablaze with fire and ringing steel, an awe-inspiring, if grim, spectacle. Still, the Quincy pressed their numeric and martial advantage hard against the Soul Reapers, determined to eradicate every last defender. And the Soul Reapers would not yield, mounting a desperate resistance to protect their home. Amid the chaos, Captain Janryusai Shigekuni Yamamoto stood unflinching. Flames danced around him as he wielded his Nodachi with unerring precision, cleaving through wave after wave of blind Quincy thralls. Their twisted battle cries echoed across the ruined courtyard. "We will bring Yamamoto Shigekuni's head to his majesty." But none could fathom the gulf between their boast and the reality of their foe. Time and again, Yamamoto's blade met Quincy bone and armor. Each swing sent shockwaves through the air, each strike a glaring reminder of his unmatchable power. Even as smoke curled in the skies above the Soul Society's battered ramparts, the captain's defiance blazed on, unbowed and unstoppable. Chapter 784. Take Action. With a single sweeping slash, Captain Yamamoto, renowned as the strongest death god of the Heat Division, cut down dozens of Quincy foot soldiers who had dared to breach the first squad's ranks. His eyes blazed with lethal precision, anger flickering like molten fire within them, as if he could burn away the very cold of this battlefield. "Damn Quincy!" he thundered, his voice rippling through the air. His beard trembled with rage, and his gaze, as sharp as drawn steel, seemed to hunger to devour every enemy in sight. Around him, the spiritual pressure that marked him as a death god ebbed away, each fleeting second robbing him of one more ally's life. His comrades, stalwart warriors he had led into battle countless times, fell like withered flowers, their rare yoku snuffed out in an instant. Each death drove a knife deeper into his heart. Grief and fury warred within Yamamoto's chest, but beneath it all lay a darker fear. The casualty count was soaring uncontrollably, like a wild steed unbound. He knew, with bitter certainty, that this war would demand a devastating toll, no matter which side emerged victorious. Despite their bravery, the Shinigami found themselves outmatched by the sheer numbers and power of the Quincy. The fight raging between the frozen palaces had reached a fever pitch. Each side tore into the other like wild beasts. Bright crimson splashed across the ice, staining the snow in a stark contrast beneath the cold moonlight. Clashes of steel rang out alongside anguished screams, victorious roars, and countless death shouts, as if the very sky might be rent apart. No one dared fall back. To retreat here was to invite instant annihilation. At the war's outset, the Quincy had turned the icy terrain against the Gotai 13, trapping them in a clever ambush that cost the lives of thousands of low-ranking Shinigami within minutes. For a force whose total strength never exceeds 10,000, such losses were catastrophic. Now each Sternritter stood ready to wield his unique, devastating ability, powers that would determine the outcome of this merciless battle. Ethan rode the edge of the whirlwind, watching as Sternritter strikes fell like a merciless storm across the Shinigami ranks. But this wasn't simply a matter of the enemy's overwhelming strength. The battlefield itself shifted with every heartbeat. The Shinigami were forced not only to parry those devastating blows, but also to guard every squad member at risk. They all understood that every fallen comrade drained Soul Society's power, and so they fought desperately to keep their subordinates alive. Yet right now, the Soul Society's combat effectiveness lay in tatters. Kenpachi Zaraki's rebellion had ripped the 11th Division apart, seizing many of its elite fighters and shattering the overall morale. As a cornerstone of Soul Society's offensive might, The 11th had always led the vanguard. Its defection left a void no other division could fill. On top of those losses, the battle squads, once bristling with captain-level leadership, remained leaderless, their officers unchosen. Their ranks depleted and command in disarray, the Shinigami found themselves stretched thinner than ever, desperately trying to hold the line against the Stern Ritter's unrelenting advance. The Soul Society was already stretched to its breaking point. Replacing lost officers and filling the ranks felt almost impossible. Then a single, authoritative voice cut through the chaos, carried by Tenjo Kora. "All Shinigami, listen up. I'll only say this once. The Quincy we're facing wield a grave and uncommon power. They can steal your Bankai. Until we discover how to counteract this ability, do not risk unleashing your Bankai. If you do, you may become a victim of your own strength. I am Mayuri Kurotsuchi of the 12th Division. My team has verified these findings repeatedly. It is absolute truth. Stand fast and hold out until we forge a remedy." Though his words resounded across the field, no one could pinpoint where Mayuri stood. Since the war began, the mad scientist Shin Agami had retreated into the shadows, pouring every ounce of his genius into research and experiments that might give the Soul Society a fighting chance. Back in the original 1st Division barracks, the mood was grim and determined. Every officer knew the battle ahead would demand everything they had. Captain General Shigekuni Yamamoto Jonryusai, the legendary Shinigami, reputed to be the strongest, sat motionless, eyes shut in deep concentration as he gathered his spiritual energy. His wooden cane tapped the stone floor in a steady rhythm. Then, at last, he rose to his full height, and an earth-shaking aura burst forth from him, as if the very air were tearing at the seams. His white haori, emblazoned with the single character E, snapped in a windless swell, a banner announcing his presence. Though age had etched lines into his face, in that moment he burned with the intensity of a noonday sun, so fierce that none dared meet his gaze. Every soul in the chamber felt their heartbeats skip a beat under the weight of his power. Yamamoto opened his eyes, steady and unwavering. "Chojiro," he said, his voice both calm and commanding, "prepare yourself. We go into battle." These words carried the weight of necessity. Losses among the captains had been mounting, and the grim report delivered by Mayuri Kurotsuchi left no doubt. Yamamoto himself had to intervene. Without hesitation, his most trusted lieutenant, Chojiro, bowed. "At once, Captain General." Ethan didn't hesitate. At Captain Yamamoto Jonryusai Shigekuni's command, he surged into battle alongside him, every muscle primed, every sense keyed in to the coming clash. Then came the roar. In an instant, a colossal wave of spiritual pressure exploded outward from Yamamoto. It was as if the very air had caught fire. The ground beneath them sizzled, heat shimmered on the horizon, and all nearby rock and soil threatened to liquefy. That single blinding surge of power carried such raw destructive force that both Shinigami and Quincy froze in place. You could almost see the pressure itself rippling through space, penetrating barriers and clawing at the edges of the soul. "It's the captain!" someone gasped. "He's finally moving!" Across the invisible empire, Allied fighters stopped dead in their tracks, eyes fixed on the source of that unimaginable aura. For every soldier on our side, Captain Yamamoto was more than a leader. He was their unshakable anchor. And now, watching him unleash that fearsome might, they felt a surge of hope and resolve. As long as he stood with them, they knew no enemy could prevail. "If he's our captain," one onlooker said, brimming with excitement, "the Quincy don't even matter. He wiped out their clan 1,000 years ago, and in another 1,000 years, he'll do it again." His words echoed through the crowd, stirring everyone around him. Chapter 785, Battle. "Absolutely, we'll win." Ethan's roar cut across the battlefield, igniting a chorus of voices that rippled through every line of Shinigami. In that instant, a palpable surge of energy banished the despair that had weighed on their hearts since they'd lost the power of the swastika. It was as if an invisible current had flooded their veins, restoring their courage and steeliness. For days, frustration and hopelessness had hovered over them like storm clouds, blotting out any chance of triumph. But the moment Commander-in-Chief Yamamoto Genryu Tesaigami Shigekuni reappeared on the field, those clouds were rent in two, and sunlight bathed the war-torn plain. The return of this legendary captain, the most formidable Soul Reaper in 1,000 years, instilled fresh hope. His very presence was a rallying cry, a force capable of tipping the scales against the arrogant Quincy. Ethan tightened his grip on his Zanpakuto, adrenaline surging as he prepared for the clash ahead. With Yamamoto leading them, he knew they stood a real chance of victory. "They say the old man finally decided to show up," murmured two members of the Zero Division, gathering not far from the front. Though they remained in Seirete to handle intelligence from the God Realm, their confidence never wavered. With their captain back in action, defeat simply wasn't an option. Ichibei Ryukin, captain commander of the Zero Division, had just returned to the Soul King's palace. Yet his presence on the palace grounds did not prompt any immediate response from Team Zero. It wasn't for lack of resolve. They were sworn to protect the Soul King and uphold the balance of the three realms, nothing more. Retaliation for the slain Shinigami lay outside their mandate. Instead, they braced themselves for the repercussions that might follow in the wake of such a brazen attack. Beyond their duty to the Soul King, they harbored deep sympathy for the fallen. After all, they had once served in the Seirete themselves, and the bonds they'd formed there still weighed on their hearts. Still, a more pressing concern tugged at them. How would the gods of the divine realm react? The Soul King himself might shrug off the incident, but lesser deities, or worse, the gods of destruction, could see it as an opportunity to strike. In the tangled politics of heaven, any sign of weakness was an invitation. So Team Zero maintained their vigil, steeling themselves against both grief and the unknown threat that lurked on the horizon. All around them, the battlefield simmered with heat, choking smoke, and swirling dust. Amid the chaos, the death gods carried a steadfast conviction in their chests, a fervor so pure it felt like the flame of their very souls. That inner fire illuminated their path forward, guiding them through the murk and promising that, no matter what came next, they would stand firm. Fueled by unshakable conviction, Captain Genryusai Shigekuni Yamamoto, renowned as the most powerful Soul Reaper in millennia, restored his force's weakening spirit with a single, earth-shattering surge of Reiatsu. That wave of power rolled across the battlefield like a tempest, banishing every trace of doubt and igniting a fierce determination in every Soul Reaper's heart. It was as if the very act of breathing had been transformed into a soul baptism. Eyes once clouded by fear now burned bright with renewed resolve. At that moment, any lingering hesitation vanished. The Soul Reapers, aflame with courage and bolstered by Yamamoto's indomitable will, launched themselves at the Quincy in a crescendo of strikes. Their attacks crashed forward in relentless succession, each blow more devastating than the last, tipping the tide of battle. The Quincy, who had believed their meticulous formations and overwhelming power would secure them an effortless victory, found themselves staggering beneath the onslaught. They had not anticipated that, when all seemed lost, the Soul Reapers could be reborn anew under the command of their legendary captain. Captain Ethan's death gods charged forward, without a hint of hesitation, their blades and shadowy forms weaving through the air in a deadly dance. Spiritual pressure crashed against spiritual pressure, creating a thunderous roar that shook the battlefield. Like savages unleashed, the Shinigami threw themselves at the Quincy lines again and again, each strike driven by a willingness to sacrifice everything in the assault. The Quincy defenders fought desperately to regroup. Every time they parried a blow, they risked another attack, and every counter seemed to meet an equally fierce riposte. This spiritual pressure, "It's overwhelming," one Quincy gasped, narrowly sidestepping a slash that would have torn him in two. He pressed trembling fingers to his uniform, eyes wide with disbelief. "Imagine if we could seize Captain Ethan's swastika," another Quincy muttered, casting a covetous look toward the death god captain. That emblem was legendary, one of the most potent abilities any Shinigami wielded. If they could wrest it from him, they might yet turn the tide. "Don't get carried away with fantasies," his comrade snapped. He forced himself to swallow hard, turning back to face the charging Shinigami. "Focus on survival. We need a real opening, something concrete." As the death gods closed in, Ethan raised his blade in salute to his troops, a fierce grin spreading across his face. Tonight, Neither fear nor self-doubt would stand in their way. What if we simply took it from him? A Quincy standing nearby spoke up coolly. Even if they could strip the captain of his insignia, they'd never harness its true power. He's just a has-been, scoffed another. Our king never regarded him as a real threat. They all believed that though Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni had been the greatest Shinigami 1,000 years ago, centuries of battle must have worn him down. Besides, their sovereign Ewok was invincible. No death god, no matter how powerful, could compare. Suddenly, a far mightier force rippled through the Serete, shaking the very air. All eyes turned skyward as a lone figure descended through roiling clouds, Ewok himself. Across that vast expanse, his gaze met Yamamoto's, as if piercing countless dimensions. Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni, Ewok's voice resonated low and majestic, carrying across the battlefield. I didn't expect your old bones could still unleash such overwhelming spiritual pressure. Yahabach! Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni only smirked, betraying no sign of weakness. Their auras clashed in midair, and in an instant the battlefield fell eerily silent. The weight of their combined Reiatsu pressed down on every soul present. Each breath felt like inhaling razor blades. And yet, buried beneath that stifling force, something far more fearsome began to rumble. Yamamoto's eyes burned with predatory focus, as keen and unerring as an eagle's. He probed the swirling gloom until he found his mark, Yuhabach, the Empire's invisible overlord. With a steady inhale, he drew the surrounding chill into his lungs, transforming the cold into his own furious power. He refused to rely on his famed Shunpo technique. Instead, he planted a single foot forward and shattered the boundaries of space and time. In the next heartbeat, he had vanished. The one after, he reappeared 100 meters closer to Yuhabach. Every step he took thundered through the air, and any Quincy foolish enough to stand in his path was reduced to dust as casually as one crushes an ant. Ethan's flames raged without mercy. In an instant, the enemy fighters caught in the inferno convulsed, their bodies shriveling until only charred husks remained. Acrid smoke spiraled into the sky, carrying the stench of burned flesh. He wiped ash from his gauntlet and took a step forward. Beyond the cracked stone arch ahead lay Ewok's hiding place, and the chance to end this battle once and for all. Ethan raised his hand, ready to unleash a final burst of fire. But before another spark could flicker into life, a massive figure plummeted from above and slammed into the ground at his feet. Dust and debris exploded outward, and Ethan froze as the stranger's enormous silhouette rose to block his path. Chapter 786, King Meets King. The newcomer was impossible to ignore. Clad in a gleaming gold mask and a wrestler's skin-tight combat suit, he cut a striking figure. At his side lay a small, bald boy with stubby arms and legs, prostrate on the deck as though he'd been felled in seconds. Together, they were members of the Invisible Empire's Star-Crossed Knights, Masco du Masculine and his partner, James. Masco's eyes burned with fanatic excitement, as if he could peer through the skies and already glimpse the bloody arena that awaited him. His pulse raced. This was the moment he dreamed of, facing the legendary Captain Ethan in single combat. He drew in a steadying breath, ready to intone his name and recite the knightly oath before the great captain. But before he could speak, Ethan's voice cut through the tense air like a frost-sharp blade. I have no use for a worthless name. The words crashed into Masco like a tidal wave of ice. Never had he been dismissed so brutally. His blood surged in indignation, heart pounding with rage. He opened his mouth to retort, only to catch sight of the sword Ethan held at his side. The Zanpakuto gleamed in Ethan's gauntleted grip, its polished blade reflecting the stormy sky. That single glimpse was enough to still Masco's fury. This was no ordinary officer. This was a captain whose reputation was carved from countless victories. And now, Masco realized with a chill thrill, he was standing directly in his path. Ethan stared in horror at the blade before him. Blackish red flames licked its edges, writhing like living creatures hungry for destruction. This was no ordinary fire. Its hue was a deep, unholy scarlet, as if it had been summoned from the furthest depths of hell itself. A cold dread seized him, and instinctively he unleashed the perfect saint body technique and pushed his static blood suit to its absolute limit. Instantly, a brilliant golden aura flared around him, suffusing his muscles with raw power. His heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to remain steady. At his side, James lent what support he could. "You've got this, Ethan," he rasped, his voice hoarse but determined. Each word resonated with an otherworldly strength that fed into Ethan's own, forging him into something fierce and relentless, like a beast primed for battle. Yet even this newfound ferocity felt pale in comparison to the captain's might. With a single, deliberate step forward, the captain advanced, and the hellish flames responded instantly, surging skyward in a crimson tide that blotted out half the heavens. The fire seemed to breathe and roar, ready to consume the entire battlefield. Through that living inferno, the captain's figure emerged, larger than life and cloaked in mystery. The dancing flames cast him in ominous relief, revealing only the outline of his armored form and the cold resolve in his eyes. In that moment, Ethan realized he was not just facing a man. He was standing across from a force of nature itself. Silence fell for a heartbeat as both warriors measured each other. Then, with the crackle of flame and the hum of unleashed power, the first thunderous clash was about to begin. Ethan brought his Zanpakuto down in a single, decisive motion. A ribbon of searing flame arced through the air like a fire dragon unleashed, its world-shattering power hurtling straight toward Masco. Terror ripped through Masco's heart as he realized there was no overcoming such destructive force. He twisted aside, desperately trying to evade the incoming blaze, but the fiery slash struck him full on. Under the blaze's onslaught, Masco's perfect holy body, encased in its crystalline blood suit, shattered like glass. Flames roared to life across his frame, and he let out a high-pitched scream that was instantly swallowed by the inferno. The blaze coalesced around him, and in a thunderous explosion his body erupted into a ball of fire. The shockwave gouged a massive crater in the earth, hurling dirt and stone in every direction. When the dust settled, only a scorched hollow remained, a silent testament to Masco's final moments. From the rim of that smoking pit, James watched in stunned disbelief. With Masco's utter defeat before him, he understood at once that there was no escape. James struggled to clamber down from Masco's back and flee, but the Captain General proved faster than he'd ever imagined. In a heartbeat, the captain appeared, and James's terrified scream was swallowed by a burst of flame. When the blaze subsided, only 2 pinches of black ash remained, the only evidence that Masco and James had ever existed. Unfazed, the Captain General pressed on. His steps were steady and unhurried as he strode over the ashen remains, never once pausing. Ahead lay Yuhabak's hidden refuge, and nothing would deter him. Around the Captain General, spiritual pressure roiled like a living inferno, eager to tear this oppressive space apart. In the flickering firelight, he loomed like a demon risen from purgatory, his battle robe etched in flickering flame patterns. With every footstep, the earth trembled and fractured, cracks spidering outward in silent testimony to his power. The battlefield was littered with the charred remnants of once mighty Quincy, like straw consumed by fire, now reduced to drifting ashes. Not far away stood King Yuhabak, the so-called Your Majesty of Quincy. His cloak billowed in the wind, as if even the breeze quaked at the coming clash. In his eyes danced a cold, cutting light. He could feel every ounce of murderous intent emanating from the Captain General's spiritual pressure. With a swift tug of his cloak, Yuhabak vanished into thin air. In the next heartbeat, he reappeared directly before his adversary, Captain General Ethan. Between them, an invisible force met and rippled outward, bending the very space around them. The air grew hot and heavy, thick with impending violence. Ethan's voice rolled across the ruined field like thunder. "Yuhabak," he declared, "I've come to end you. Today, you will not slip away as you did 1,000 years ago." A blaze of determination lit his eyes. He was ready to burn down every obstacle that stood in his path. Yuwak's lips curled into a derisive smile. "You're getting old, Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni." His voice was deceptively soft. "You might look young again, wreathed in flames, but that murderous intent of yours leaves no room for mercy." The captain snorted, his eyes steely cold. "You don't know the first thing about me." Yuwak chuckled, every bit as contemptuous. "Old man, you're the one who doesn't get it." He raised a hand in dismissal. "Facing His Majesty alone, you'll regret that arrogance." At his command, 3 stern-looking figures sprang from the shadows behind Yuwak. Each bore the mark of a stern ritter, and wielded a Quincy weapon with lethal precision. Empowered by Ewok's holy scripture, their spiritual pressure rivaled even that of the 13th Division's captain. With a fierce battle cry, they charged at Yamamoto without hesitation. Chapter 787. This was no ordinary flame. It was pure spiritual pressure. Yet standing before Captain Ethan, the Quincy who'd boasted of their power looked no larger than ants. With a casual flick of his wrist, Ethan unleashed a blinding arc of light that tore through the air in a thunderous roar. A pillar of fire shot skyward like a dragon rising from the depths, twisting and writhing as it consumed everything in its path. 3 captain-level Quincy, once the pride of their order, were utterly defenseless. Their screams were snuffed out the instant the inferno hit, leaving only the acrid tang of smoke and charred flesh behind. In that moment, their lives were as fragile as insect shells, crushed effortlessly beneath Ethan's overwhelming power. His second kill. The onlookers were frozen in disbelief. Before Captain General Ethan, 3 of their finest had fallen without so much as a chance to draw their weapons. Such raw, unchallenged force was beyond anything they had ever imagined. Ewok didn't even flinch. He regarded the scene with the cool detachment of a man who expected everything to unfold exactly as it had. There was no hint of sympathy in his eyes, only the cold calculation of someone who sees his followers as nothing more than expendable pieces on a chessboard. "Foolish of you," he said softly, his voice thick with disdain. "You've clearly misjudged your own limits, and now you've meddled in my fight." He swept a contemptuous glance over the quivering Quincy ranks, as if he were staring down a colony of ants. Across from him, the Captain General's expression grew icier still. "You're just the same as ever, cold as steel and twice as merciless." Anger crackled in his voice. He remembered all too well the horrors Ewok had unleashed, countless innocent lives crushed under his command. Ewok laughed, a low, mirthless chuckle. "And you," he retorted with a sneer, "the very man who slaughtered legions, dare call me heartless?" The 2 adversaries stood facing each other, the air between them crackling with accusation and contempt. Neither was willing to back down. "You've forgotten who you are, and what you once were. You've grown soft over the centuries. A life of comfort has eroded your fighting spirit." Ewok's voice dripped with icy scorn. To him, the great captain was no longer the merciless force of legend, but merely a protector of the Soul Society, no longer one who killed for the sake of killing. "Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni, your blade has lost its edge." His words were meant to wound, for the captain's sword was the very symbol of his honor and soul. Yet Yamamoto did not flinch. He met Ewok's gaze with equal coldness. In the growing dusk, their eyes locked like flint against steel, each daring the other to strike first. "Edge or no edge, you're welcome to find out," the captain replied, his voice low and resonant. He lifted his flowing blade, its slender form catching the last rays of the setting sun and burning with a fiery glow. As he shifted into stance, a tremendous wave of Reiatsu slammed outward, a silent promise of the storm to come. Ethan's spiritual pressure exploded outward like an invisible shockwave, driving the already arid air to sweltering heights. Each breath tasted faintly of embers. Under its force, the world around him seemed to buckle and distort. Branches and leaves glowed blood-red, threatening to ignite at any moment. Sand and gravel quivered, emitting soft cracks beneath his overwhelming aura. Behind him, flames roared like a crimson tide, spiritual fire infused with the depths of his power, coiling and lashing through the air as if eager to consume everything in their path. And yet, despite this inferno, Ethan himself remained unnervingly composed. In a single, fluid motion, he swept Ryujin Jaka before him. A sharper, more formidable pressure surged from the blade, slicing through the atmosphere like a razor's edge and drawing a high-pitched hiss from the heated air. Under the force's influence, the raging flames were snuffed out in an Nintuan, Bankai, Zanka no Tachi, Ethan roared. In the blink of an eye, Ryujin Jaka was transformed. The once blazing blade turned dry and charred, its surface brittle and carbonized. Though it looked battered and unsightly, it pulsed with an almost limitless power. Zanka no Tachi is the full release of Ryujin Jaka, Ethan's ultimate technique. In Bankai form, the sword's strength skyrockets, but with that surge of power comes a greater challenge in wielding it. For Ethan, however, control was never a concern. He had fused the sword's essence so completely with his own spirit that blade and wielder moved as one. Across the battlefield, Ewok fixed his gaze on the smoldering relic of fire. A shadow of solemn remembrance passed over his features. He had faced this very weapon 1,000 years ago and been defeated by it. Although its appearance had changed, the same oppressive intensity lingered in the air, warning him that even one strike from the former Zanka no Tachi had the power to end everything. Ethan stood at the heart of Seirete, gripping Zanka Tachi as its blackened blade seethed with smoldering heat. Though the sword's once elegant form was now scarred and jagged, the spiritual pressure it emitted had never been greater. At his command, the blade began to move, slow, deliberate arcs that sliced through the air with a high-pitched whistle, as if tearing the very fabric of space itself. Despite the ferocity of its power, Ethan felt no outward flames. His own Reiatsu contained the sword's inferno, preventing any visible fire or scorching aura from manifesting around him. Yet all across the Soul Society, the temperature was climbing. The humid air turned stale and desiccated. Moisture vanished, leaving dust motes dancing in the newly arid breeze. Soldiers felt their lips crack, their throats parched as though seared from within. Even the water in their canteens, meant to offer relief, boiled away almost instantly under Zanka Tachi's oppressive spiritual heat. Warriors scrambled to refill their bottles, but every drop dissolved into vapor before it could pass their lips. Whispers spread through the ranks. Something was terribly wrong. And at the center of it all, Ethan remained unwavering, every slow swing of his weapon reshaping the very atmosphere of the Soul Society. Ethan, Nuo, felt a suffocating heat down on him. He frowned. This isn't the same. He couldn't put his finger on what had changed. Until now, Captain Yamamoto's relentless assault had cut down several Sternritter, barely keeping the power scales balanced between the Soul Reapers and the Quincy. But the moment Ichigo Kurosaki and Kisuke Urahara emerged from the real world, everything shifted. Grimjoe and the others bound to the original storyline hadn't appeared, but Urahara had. Exploiting the temporal distortions of the Dangai, Urahara engineered a shadow invasion drug designed to strip Quincy of their Bankai. For the Quincy, anything hollow-related was toxic. Even knowing the drug could hollowify part of their bodies, most captains swallowed it without hesitation. A stubborn few, whether out of pride, overconfidence, or revulsion at the thought of partial hollowification, refused, but they were the exception. Ichigo's arrival with his reinforcements instantly eased the strain on the Soul Society, tipping the battle's momentum in their favor. Ethan hadn't undergone the moonless stage or reclaimed his full Shinigami powers, yet he was far from weak. He still relied on a counterfeit Bankai, his Tensa Zangetsu, which wasn't even a true Zanpakuto. It was, in fact, Zangetsu's makeshift blade, forged from the essence of the Quincy spirit bow to serve him in battle. All around them, the battlefield churned with smoke and chaos. What had begun as a clearly one-sided conflict was now evenly matched. On every front, Shinigami captains and Sternritter officers clashed in a cacophony of blades, spirit energy, and war cries. Drums hammered the air, fueling the frenzy. Yet despite the swirling tide of skirmishes, everyone knew the real heart of this war lay not in the dozens of duels, but in the titanic clash at its center, Ethan versus Ewok. The two stood like opposing mountains, immovable and potent. If either fell, the balance of power would shatter in an instant. When they finally faced each other atop the scarred earth, the roar of battle seemed to fade. Time itself held its breath. Ethan's dark-eyed gaze locked onto Ewok's as though they could peer straight into each other's souls. Neither gave a warning, neither uttered a cry. In the same heartbeat, they surged forward, spirit pressure flaring, and blades met in a cataclysmic clash that shook the ground beneath them. Ethan tightened his grip on the hilt, every muscle coiled for the strike. He unleashed the forms of Zanka Tachi in rapid succession, each blow driving Ewok farther back until he had the tyrant cornered. When they met on the field, it was like two meteors colliding, an explosion of light so fierce it seared the darkness. Their clash rang out like thunder, every impact reverberating through the earth. Pressing his advantage, Ethan forced Ewok on the run, blade whirling in a flaming dance. Then, with a roar that split the night, he called upon Zanka Tachi's ultimate technique, East Rising Sunblade. In that instant, every ember of flame within the sword compressed into its edge, generating a heat so intense it could erase anything it touched without leaving a trace. Yuwak, unaware of the blade's true nature, slammed his two-handed sword against the oncoming strike. But instead of fracturing under the blast, his weapon simply vanished. No melting, no cracks, just obliteration. The tyrant didn't even realize what had happened until the familiar weight in his hands was gone. Ethan's heart dropped as he looked down at his sword. The two-handed blade he'd wielded for years now lay in ruins. Only a jagged fragment of the hilt remained in his grasp. He could scarcely believe his eyes. The weapon that had seen him through countless battles was gone in a heartbeat. Zankadachi, West Zanri, prison garb, the captain intoned, each word punctuating a devastating movement. Before Ethan could react, the captain unleashed his ultimate Bankai, the pinnacle of power that had earned him the title Death God of the Millennium. In an instant, the captain's form dissolved into living fire. His Reiatsu coalesced into a furnace of 15 million degrees, wrapping him like a blazing sun. The inferno engulfed his body and sword alike, forging an impenetrable wall of flame. Any warrior who dared block his path was incinerated on the spot, reduced to ash before they could draw breath. Even Yuwak himself, the progenitor of the Quincy, felt the weight of that fiery onslaught. Forced to activate his ultimate defense, the static blood suit, he could do nothing but hold his ground as the captain's flames pressed in. Despite his legendary resilience, Yuwak's armor groaned under the relentless heat, barely keeping the searing power at bay. Ethan's flame coat burnished the air around him with a blistering heat, 15 million degrees, far beyond the threshold of any mortal blaze. It flared beyond the visible spectrum, an inferno no human eye could bear. Yet these weren't ordinary flames at all, but the pure projection of his vast spiritual pressure made manifest, utterly immune to the laws of nature. In over a millennium, no death god had ever displayed such power. Yuwak's static blood suit shuddered in the face of that advancing heat, cracking at the seams as though it might collapse any moment. Terror gripped him. If Ethan stepped any closer, he would be reduced to ash in an instant. Desperate to keep his distance, Yuwak drew a colossal bow out of the void, his sacred Quincy weapon, and knocked a glowing arrow. With a hiss that shredded the air, the arrow launched straight for Ethan. But when the arrow was barely a meter from him, it erupted in flames and disintegrated, consumed by the very heat it had sought to withstand. Ethan stood unharmed, the remnant sun prison robe around him blazing more fiercely than ever. Its defense was absolute. No attack, however sacred, could touch him. The battlefield fell silent under the roar of his undying fire. Ethan stood firm as Ewok's energy blasts washed harmlessly over him. He gave a faint, confident smile. Useless. You can't hurt me. His tone was calm, unshakable. Ewok's face darkened with anger and disbelief. As the progenitor of the Quincy, he was no stranger to overwhelming power, but never before had he been so thoroughly humiliated. Still, he refused to yield. This duel would be decided by more than the Quincy Cross or the Holy Arrow of Extinction. Clenching his fingers, he traced invisible runes in the air, his secret inheritance as the Quincy Patriarch. From each fingertip, a torrent of radiant symbols sprang to life. One by one, they coalesced into shimmering spears of solid light, piercing the sky before cascading down to form a vast circular barrier. Layer upon layer of spirit-forged halberds locked together, creating a sanctuary of sacred radiance around Ewok. Within its bounds, he raised his voice in a resonant chant, holy chant, hymn to the sanctuary. A hush fell on the battlefield. This was the Quincy's ultimate defense and offense, wrought from pure spirit. As the dome of light pulsed and glowed, Ethan braced himself for the next move in what was quickly becoming a legendary clash. Any outsider who dared cross into that domain would be consumed by the sacred judgment of light, reduced utterly to ashes. Chapter 789, The Counterfeit and the Real Owner. Even as Ewok unleashed his holy chant and the tribute to the Holy Land, Yamamoto Gunrisai Shigekuni remained perfectly still. He flipped Zankatachi in his hand, drove its tip into the earth, and intoned in a voice heavy with authority, "Dead souls, ashes scattered by my flames, by your power I grant you, if only briefly, the ecstasy of battle." The moment his words fell upon the wind, the air around him seemed to shiver awake. The ground trembled, and from the fissures seeped a rolling tide of inky black air that coalesced into the sky above the battlefield. At the silent beckoning of Zankatachi, centuries-old ashes began to swirl and condense. One by one, they took shape as warriors, once mighty fighters who had fallen to Yamamoto's blade in bygone battles. Reforged by the feverish heat of the blade, these revenants burst forth from the soil as jet-black skeletons, weapons clutched in their bony hands, eyes aglow with an icy light. Their numbers were staggering, a relentless legion of the dead, reborn to serve under their master's command. Ethan's skeletal battalion stretched across the battlefield in dense, unbroken ranks. Each grinning skull and hollow ribcage gleamed dully under the overcast sky, as if reborn with a single purpose, to defend their captain. Ethan stood calmly behind them, one hand resting on the hilt of his Zanpakuto, Zankatachi. His sharp eyes swept over the waiting dead, and his presence seemed to fuse with their brittle forms, forging an aura of unyielding resolve. Across the field, Yuhabach, proud leader of the Quincy, watched them with thinly veiled contempt. Ethan allowed a cool, confident smile. "These are not mindless puppets," he called. "They are the ashes of the souls I have judged, rekindled by Zankatachi's heat. They are my hands and my feet, and they will hunt down every enemy I condemn, reducing them to ash so they may finally rest." A mocking laugh escaped Yuhabach. "You really believe a few hollow bones can stand in my way?" With that, he vanished in a swift blur of motion, the air itself seeming to tear, as he unleashed his Fei Leon kick. In an instant, he reappeared directly before Ethan, his attack already in full force. Ethan surged forward like a wraith, so quick that no one could track his movement. The skeletal warriors arrayed before him, those he couldn't simply dodge, shattered under his effortless strikes. With every swing, a torrent of oppressive spiritual pressure burst forth as if to obliterate anything standing in his way. Though countless withered bones pressed in from every side, they crumbled like brittle twigs at his touch. Pathetic, Yuhabach spat, watching with thin contempt. He couldn't fathom what Captain Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni was doing. Instead of unleashing his feared Zanka no Tachi, remaining sun burial robe, Yamamoto had summoned these fragile revenants. Was the cost of maintaining that final Getsuga Tensho simply too great? "Yuhabach," the old swordsman's voice rang out, laced with mockery. "After 1,000 years, your eyes still aren't as sharp as you claim." A swirling wall of ash and bone sealed Yuhabach in place. He scowled, narrowing his eyes. As he stared at the fragments of souls drifting around him, realization hit. These weren't hollow remnants at all, but the dispersed spirits of Quincy. His own army turned to dust around him. The battlefield was strewn with ashes and bleached bones, the remnants of Quincy long dead, summoned once more 1,000 years after their war against the god of death. Familiar faces and unfamiliar ones drifted through the haze, and even someone as cold and ruthless as Ewok found himself momentarily disoriented. Before Ewok could regroup, Captain Ethan's voice rang out clear and commanding. "Zankatachi, north, Tiandi ashes." At his call, a dazzling torrent of swordlight exploded from Ethan's blade, blotting out sky and earth with its brilliance. The light coiled like an immense dragon, reducing everything in its path to drifting ash. Caught, wholly off guard, Ewok felt a tremendous force slam into his waist, then agony as his body was rent in two. Horror and defiance flickered in his eyes, but he had no power left to resist. As Ewok collapsed, the skeletal Quincy army dissolved into nothingness. Silence reclaimed the battlefield. Only Captain Ethan remained, standing alone among the remnants of war. He slowly sheathed his long sword, a tired yet deeply satisfied smile crossing his face. The grudges of 1,000 years have ended. Captain Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni's voice rolled across the rain-drenched battlefield, carrying the sorrow of an age-old feud. He turned deliberately as chilling air condensed into heavy raindrops, each one hammering the earth. Before him lay Yuwatch, his body broken, yet his obsidian eyes still burned with fierce resolve. Gathering his last strength, he lifted a trembling hand toward the stormy sky and spoke in a low, hoarse whisper, "I'm sorry." Those 3 words cut through the shattered silence like a blade. Yamamoto's head snapped around in disbelief. He knew Wak, proud founder and king of the Quincy, would never offer an apology without grave cause. "Hold on," he cried. "You are the ruler of the Quincy. To whom do you owe this apology? His question hung between distant thunderclaps. Then Yamamoto's gaze fell to the ground, and his blood ran cold. The shattered figure at their feet was not Ewok at all, but Ethan. Limbs splayed at impossible angles, Ethan's face lay pale under the pounding rain, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Struck by the sight, Yamamoto knelt beside him, the centuries-old vendetta finally giving way to something neither of them had expected: mercy. A tall, bald man stood waiting on the battlefield, round ear protectors framing his head, each rim nicked and worn. His face was carved from stone, deep-set eyes brooding beneath thin, arched brows, and at the center of his forehead burned the mark of the third eye. Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni felt something snap in his bones. This was not the genuine Ewok, but a carefully crafted impostor. Every detail, his posture, tone, even the cadence of his words, matched Ewok's so closely it was uncanny. Yet under close scrutiny, the differences emerged, a flicker of emotion too human for the true Ukenbearer, a seething loathing aimed at Yamamoto for using his Bankai to resurrect Quincy warriors as mindless soldiers. Until now, Yamamoto had simply assumed Ewok's personality would shift after 1,000 years in slumber. Now he saw that such traces of humanity were the clone's fatal flaw, and also proof there must be a deeper motive behind this confrontation. No way the real Ewok would send a facsimile into battle without reason. A ripple of air heralded his arrival. And there, stepping through the haze, was the true Ewok himself. Chapter 790, The Cold-Blooded Quincy Ancestor. A suffocating pressure filled the air as Ewok stepped out of the darkness. His gaze swept across the gathered figures before coming to rest on Genryusai Shigekuni Yamamoto. Contrary to the original timeline, where Ewok would have sought out Sosuke Aizen, this time, Aizen wasn't even in the Seirete. Instead, Ewok had dispatched an impostor to feed on Yamamoto's Reiatsu and probe his swastika technique. Hidden in the shadows, he had painstakingly analyzed every nuance of Yamamoto's power. Now that his research was complete, there was just one loose end to tie up. Silently, Ewok approached the man known as Lloyd. He offered a smooth, insincere compliment, watching Lloyd's face light up with pride. Then, without warning, Ewok struck. In an instant, Lloyd was erased. No bones, no trace remained, as though he'd never existed at all. To Ewok, the impostor had long since outlived his usefulness. Even a servant's stain was intolerable on his record. With that cold decision made, Ewok turned away, his purpose here fulfilled. Ewok never settles for anything less than total victory and an unassailable plan for domination. He's utterly indifferent to the deaths of his subordinates, and he won't hesitate to sacrifice himself, either. Cold-blooded and ruthless, he remains an enigma. Why would anyone pledge loyalty to a man so utterly without mercy? And with his disappearance, the single force capable of standing toe-to-toe with Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni and even defeating Kenpachi Zaraki unmasked, vanished from the field. At that moment, Captain Genryusai understood why Hashwalth of the Sternritter had greeted Ewok's death with complete and chilling composure. It had all been a facade, a meticulously devised illusion. He breathed in sharply. What a cunning trap! His murmured words were barely audible, yet his eyes, sharp as drawn blades, bore unflinching into Ewok's form, unchanged and impervious. Now, those same eyes blazed with a new, intoxicating light, the immutable pride and confidence of a victor. A most thrilling battle, Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni, Ewok said, his voice low and magnetic. Ethan strode forward, each step measured and unhurried, as though he alone determined who would live or die on this battlefield. At his feet lay the smoldering ash of the captain's men, their bodies reduced to cinders in an instant. "You bastard!" the captain snarled, clutching his sword's hilt as he prepared to summon the devastating swastika technique once more. But just as fury threatened to consume him, a sudden memory gave him pause. His eyes flickered with uncertainty. He drew in a steadying breath, forced down his rage, and abandoned the swastika in favor of the more reliable Shiji. Ethan's face betrayed a momentary disappointment, swiftly concealed under a mask of calm. In secret, he had studied the captain's command of the swastika, also called the residual fire sword, down to its smallest detail. He knew it was the captain's greatest strength and his deepest vulnerability. As long as he could force Captain Yamamoto to release his Bankai again, he'd have the chance to seize it, and with it, guarantee his victory. Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni, Ewok snarled. I'll personally send you to hell today. He planted both hands on his sword's hilt and groaned as a deep, shadowy radiance poured from the blade. From every direction, countless spirits, summoned by some ancient force, rushed toward the weapon, sharpening its edge and magnifying its dread power. Just like 1,000 years ago, you'll make the same mistakes again, he taunted. The old captain's lips curled into a grim sneer. He gripped his own sword as if it were a flame, and in a sense it was. Not ordinary fire, but a roaring inferno born of Yamamoto's immense spiritual pressure. For a long, suspended heartbeat, the two warriors faced each other in silence. Then, Ewok let out a furious roar and swung his massive two-handed sword in a sky-shattering arc. Ethan refused to be outdone. He swung, both blades in a single, fluid motion, sending a torrent of searing flame surging forward. The blaze met Ewok's pitch-black sword energy in midair with a thunderous crack. Scorching heat and inky shadow clashed and roared, each force vying for dominance. Ethan's fire billowed like a tidal wave, eager to consume the darkness, while Ewok's black aura stood firm as an impenetrable barrier. No matter how violently Ethan's flames thrashed, they could not crack the shadowy wall. For a tense moment, flame and darkness locked in stalemate, each growing more potent, Ethan's fire burning brighter, Ewok's shadow thickening. Sparks and motes of energy spun between them, unleashed power crackling on the still air. Then, without warning, Ewok counterattacked. He hefted his greatsword, and a surge of black energy, more intense than before, erupted from the blade, coiling toward Ethan like a colossal dragon born of night. Wherever Ewok's black sword energy sliced through the air, it shredded the atmosphere into razor-thin fragments that whistled on the wind. Sensing imminent peril, Ethan, the captain, called upon his Lu Ren Ruo Huo, igniting a towering blade of flame to absorb the onslaught. Yet even that fierce inferno was no match. With a single crushing blow, the dark sword tore his fiery weapon apart. Waves of flame burst outward in a wide arc, upheaving the earth beneath Ethan's feet and filling the sky with a deafening roar. As ash and ember scattered, the lingering spirit particles compressed into a searing crackle. Ewok brushed a hand over the scorched edges of his cloak and shook his head, admiration and regret mingling in his voice. You've proven yourself worthy, Ethan. No Bankai, and you still push me so far. But this is where it ends. Don't get cocky, Ethan roared, every word booming across the empty battlefield. I could have beaten you 1,000 years ago, and luck won't save you now. In the next heartbeat, he vanished, unleashing Shunpo's lightning-fast step. Ethan reappeared at Ewok's side in an instant, Ryujin Jaka blazing brilliantly in his grasp, ready to strike. Flames roared along Ethan's blade, fierce, unending, as if they intended to swallow every trace of darkness. With unrivaled force, he swung the scorching sword straight at Ewok's head. Yet Ewok stood unmoved, as unshakable as a mountain. Just before the blade could strike, he shifted lightly to the side, effortlessly evading the captain's mighty blow. Chapter 791 sees a flicker of surprise cross the captain's eyes. He hadn't expected his opponent to absorb that blow so effortlessly. Instantly, though, he recovered, resolve gleaming in his gaze. He lifted his flowing blade in a sweeping arc, shifting from a chop to a wide, fiery slash. The blade ripped through the air with a high-pitched whistle, flames licking outward as its momentum grew. He drove the attack straight at Ethan, but Ethan showed no hint of fear. He gripped his greatsword with one hand, the static blood armor's power shielding him from the searing heat. With unwavering calm, he met the captain's strike head-on. Steel rang against steel in a deafening clash, sparks spraying everywhere. The captain's two-handed assault failed to budge Ethan's steadfast blade, and a contemptuous smile curled on Ethan's lips. Without hesitation, Ethan slammed his sword downward. The force of his static blood armor surged through the strike like a tidal wave, instantly quelling the captain's raging flames and sending them scattering into the air. Ethan barely had time to choke out a muffled groan before Ewok's two-handed sword smashed into his chest, driving him back 2 steps. Gasping, he looked down to see a jagged, bone-shattering wound across his breastplate, blood spouting in a dark arc and turning his uniform crimson. Ewok's lips curled into a contemptuous smile. Is that the best you can do? Pathetic. You should be stronger than this. He advanced slowly, studying Ethan's battered form as though peeling back his defenses. Or did my little decoy earlier convince you I was merely an average opponent? Each syllable dripped with scorn. Ethan said nothing. He simply raised his head, teeth clenched against the searing pain. Drawing a shuddering breath, he summoned every reserve of strength within him. "Do you really think I'm done?" he demanded at last, voice hoarse but unwavering. His eyes blazed with defiance. A crackling surge of energy built around him. Then, with an earth-shaking boom, Ethan thrust himself forward once more. Suddenly, a roaring burst of flame shot skyward like a scorching pillar. Through the searing inferno, Ethan staggered out, his cloak reduced to charred scraps drifting in the heat. Pain laced across his burned back contorted his features, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself upright. "Want to trade wounds for wounds? Fine by me," he snarled. He hadn't expected the captain to sacrifice himself like this, blowing a massive counterattack just to get him back. Ethan's eyes flashed with fury as he glared at Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni. "Humph, you call that an attack? A mere parlor trick." The captain only sneered, amusement flickering in his ancient battle-hardened eyes. Ethan's scowl deepened into something feral. He leaned forward, as if trying to peer through centuries of legend and see the man beneath the title. "Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni," he spat. "I thought you were just another outdated veteran. I didn't expect this kind of strength from you, but maybe underestimating you was exactly what I needed. If your sword is truly that blunt, then you might as well give up living." Yuhabachi's lips curled into a sneer. He despised the thought of being wounded. Opposite him stood Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni, utterly composed. His eyes burned like twin furnaces as he countered coolly. "You call yourself the founder of the Quincy, yet you're nothing but a failure. A millennium ago, I defeated you, and today will be no different." A flicker of contempt crossed Yuhabachi's face. With deliberate slowness, he sheathed the massive Zweihander in his hands. In an instant, the terrifying blade reformed into a small, ornate badge that snapped onto his chest. The moment the badge clicked into place, Yuhabachi's body quivered. Ambient spirit particles roared to life, drawn in from every direction to form a colossal, churning vortex around him. Raw power crackled within that maelstrom, as though it hungered to swallow the world. At the heart of the swirling vortex, the holy extinction arrow materialized. It descended like a falling star, its sleek form stretching and widening until it became a monumental spirit sword. Its crystalline edge radiated an unearthly light, promising to slice through any obstacle in its path. Yuak reached out and gripped the hilt of his massive sword. With a casual swing, the blade cut through the air, emitting a sharp, ringing crack. Lifting his head, his eyes burned with a mixture of madness and unwavering confidence as he stared down Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni, a cruel smile curling his lips. "Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni," Yuak said quietly, "I've changed my mind. If you won't unleash your Bankai, then you serve no purpose. I will personally tear down the Soul Society you claim to protect." Across from him, Yamamoto's ancient eyes remained calm. "If you can do it," he replied, "be my guest." Yuach's lips twisted. "You may not realize it, but as the progenitor of the Quincy, I don't just grant power, I can bestow it upon myself." No sooner had the words left his mouth than his presence shifted. A tremendous weight built around him, pressing on the very air and warping the space nearby. Under the astonished gazes of the gathered captains, Iwak's Ryatsu surged upward in a wave, each moment swelling more forcefully than the last. The ground trembled beneath the raw power radiating from the Quincy King, power that threatened to crush even the oldest, mightiest Shinigami. Ethan's eyes narrowed to razor-sharp slits, as though he could pierce straight into a person's heart. Stripping you of your Bankai isn't about stealing your power. Yuak stepped forward, and with each footfall his presence grew more immense. "All I desire," he said, voice resonant, "is something that will forever remind me of you, my worthy opponent, when I look back on these days." At that moment, Genryusai Yamamoto's eyes went wide. He had always regarded the Quincy's founder as a formidable adversary, but this display of power was beyond anything he'd ever encountered. A cold dread settled in his chest, as if he were at any moment to be swallowed by Yuak's overwhelming aura. As the source of all Quincy ability, Yuak alone bestowed power upon his followers, yet his methods were far more sinister. Whenever he granted someone Quincy abilities, he would cleave off a fragment of his own soul and bind it to the recipient. Then, when that person died, every shard of knowledge, every skill and memory they had ever acquired would flood back into him. Over the 1,000 years of his imprisonment, Ewok had been quietly reclaiming the talents of every mixed-blood Quincy he encountered, absorbing their strength for his own. Chapter 792, Defeat. Ewok stood motionless, his form enveloped in an almost imperceptible aura that lent him an air of mystery and dread. His eyes, cold and unfathomable, seemed to peer through every illusion, dredging up the darkest fears buried in the hearts of his opponents. Gone was the weakened progenitor of the Quincy, bereft of heartbeat, consciousness, and power. In his place stood a new, indescribable terror. A storm of energy churned within him, drawn from the Quincies he had deemed expendable and absorbed. In mere moments, that reclaimed power lifted him to heights of might no one else could approach. A palpable oppression rolled off him like thunder, sweeping across the battlefield and leaving every defender gasping as if the very air had grown too thin. Before Ewok, all resistance felt trivial, mere playthings he could annihilate with a flick of his hand. And then, in a heartbeat, he was gone. The speed of his movement was beyond anything the onlookers had ever witnessed. Even Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni, once the only man able to match Ewok's blow for blow, found himself hopelessly outpaced. "Farewell, my old adversary." Ewok's voice thundered across the scorched battlefield. He loomed behind Captain Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni, a cruel smile twisting his lips. With a single motion, he summoned a colossal spirit sword and brought it crashing down, its jagged edge crackling with overwhelming power, enough to sever Yamamoto in two. To everyone's astonishment, Yamamoto didn't flinch. He planted his feet and met the attack head-on. Instantly, Ryujin Jaka erupted into a pillar of crimson flame, colliding with Ewok's blade in a blinding flash. The impact rang like thunder. Ack! The shockwave drove Yamamoto back, ash and embers swirling around him. Still, he refused to fall. Gritting his teeth, sweat and soot streaking his face, he steadied himself and raised his fiery sword. Ewok's cold laughter cut through the roar. "Impressive. You still have fight left in you," he taunted, stepping forward as flames danced across his own weapon. "But tell me, Captain, how long can you hold out without unleashing your Bankai?" Yamamoto's grip tightened on Ryujin Jaka. He'd already fallen for Ewok's earlier fight, and it had drained a great deal of his spiritual power. Yet here he stood, every ounce of his resolve burning brighter than ever. Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni felt his strength ebbing fast. Worse still, he knew that if Ewok managed to strip him of his Bankai, it would deal a crippling blow to the entire Soul Society. He could not afford to unleash his ultimate power rashly, yet facing Ewok's ever-increasing might, he had no choice but to stand his ground and fight for every precious second. Ewok raised his Reiatsu-charged greatsword and swung again, this strike even more brutal than the last. Energy waves pulsed outward, tearing at the air itself, enough force to shatter any captain's Bankai on the spot. Yamamoto inhaled deeply, gathering every shred of spiritual pressure into Ryujin Jaka. Flames roared down the blade as he confronted Ewok's attack head-on. Boom! The collision cracked the silence like thunder. A shockwave rippled through the palace, bringing walls crashing down around them. Yamamoto was sent flying, slamming into the stone ramparts with bone-jarring force. Dust filled the air, but even as his robes were torn and his body battered, his unyielding spirit burned brighter than ever. Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni felt as though his very bones were being sundered, but he gritted his teeth and refused to fall. He coughed, spitting blood onto the cracked ground, and staggered to his feet. His pallid face belied the fierce determination burning in his eyes. Across the courtyard, Ewok regarded him with cool surprise. He had not expected the old captain to rise again after such a devastating blow. A mocking smile curled at Ewok's lips. With a casual flick of his finger, he summoned a hail of tiny, glowing sacred arrows that descended in a relentless downpour. Yamamoto braced himself. With a sweep of his flowing blade, a dazzling torrent of flame, he met Ewok's assault head-on. Each arrow that struck his fiery edge detonated in a thunderous explosion, sending sparks cascading into the sky. Still, the sheer volume of Ewok's attack was overwhelming. One by one, Yamamoto's slashes were beaten back by the tide of arrows, and at last, a particularly massive burst sent him reeling. He flew through the air like a fallen kite, limbs flailing helplessly, until he crashed against the palace wall with bone-shaking force. Stone and mortar splintered beneath him as he slumped to the ground, the fiery glow in his eyes flickering, but not yet extinguished. Boom! The thunderous impact shattered the night, rattling even the invisible empire itself. Ethan was thrown back, blood gushing from the corners of his mouth and staining his collar crimson. His body trembled under the force of the blow, but he refused to yield. Gritting his teeth, he spat out a thick rope of blood, his face suddenly ashen. He didn't have a moment to tend to his wounds. Ewok's onslaught was far from over. Summoning every last ounce of willpower, Ethan forced himself to his feet, steadying his stance by planting his sword, Ryujin Jaka, blade first into the ground. His pulse thundered in his ears as he braced for the next strike. Across the battlefield, Ewok studied Ethan's unyielding silhouette. A flicker of admiration crossed his eyes before he snuffed it out, recalling that there could be no mercy this day. He raised his hand, curling his fingers into a tight fist. High above them, points of light blinked into existence, coalescing into an endless barrage of glowing arrows. They descended in a swift, unrelenting storm, each shaft humming with world-shattering power, ready to reduce everything, including Ethan, to dust. A sudden barrage of explosions rocked the clearing where Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni stood. Flames flared skyward, and a choking cloud of smoke and debris drifted across the battlefield. At that same moment, Yuhabach slashed his spirit sword through the air. Instantly, a colossal spirit bow materialized behind him, and with a single sweeping gesture, he loosed several spectral arrows. They streaked through the moonlit sky like blazing meteors, each one charged with destructive energy and aimed directly at Yamamoto. Boom, boom, boom came the thunderous impacts as the arrows struck the earth. The ground shattered beneath their force, revealing a yawning, bottomless chasm. Radiating outward from the pit, spiderweb cracks split the earth in every direction, shaking the very foundations of the surrounding buildings. One by one, walls and rooftops gave way, sending plumes of dust and rubble billowing into the air. Though Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni braced himself against the onslaught and summoned every ounce of his strength in defiance, the raw power of those spirit arrows proved overwhelming. In an instant, the great swordsman was swallowed by the roaring void. Chapter 793, the 96th Tao Severance, Cremation by a Single Blade. A choking pall of smoke clung to the air, gradually thinning until the battered form of Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni came into view. He lay prone amid the ruin, his frame so frail it seemed a mere breath might snuff it out. He had no strength left to rise, his chest heaved with ragged breaths as he struggled to remain conscious. Clad in the soot-streaked robes of a fallen warrior, Ethan gripped his spirit sword and advanced with measured steps. Each footfall echoed with finality, the end of an age. His eyes burned with resolute purpose. "Farewell, Genryusai," he intoned softly, voice low and cold as steel. He raised the long blade high. Its keen edge quivered, aimed straight at the venerable swordsman's crown, poised to deliver the finishing strike. For a moment, time seemed to stall. The world held its breath. Then, just as the blade's tip was about to descend, the old master's eyelids snapped open. From those ancient sockets blazed an unwavering flame, fierce and indomitable, as though it could consume even the heavens themselves. In that instant, neither Ethan's sword nor Genryusai's frailty would determine the outcome. Something far greater had just been awakened. Hado 96, One Blade Cremation. Genryusai Yamamoto Shigekuni poured every ounce of his strength into that final incantation. His roar rolled across the barren battlefield, shaking the very air itself. Ewok's eyes widened in shock. He hadn't expected his adversary to muster so devastating an attack. He staggered backward, desperately trying to evade the oncoming strike, but it was already too late. With a thunderous crack, the sky itself seemed to rip open, and a massive blade of crimson flame surged heavenward. Like a demon unleashed from the depths of hell, it bore down with unrelenting fury. The searing heat and raw power of the fiery sword instantly engulfed both combatants at its core, threatening to reduce them, and everything around them, to ash. The blade writhed in midair like a titanic dragon, its blistering aura distorting the surrounding space. The superheated currents hissed and wailed, as though the wind itself was crying out in terror. Centered on Ewatch, the inferno expanded in every direction, laying waste to a radius of dozens of kilometers. Nothing would survive the all-consuming blaze of one-blade cremation. Even from afar, Hasward stood no chance. He was instantly swallowed by an inferno of terrifying heat. Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni had unleashed his ultimate technique, one-blade cremation. This extraordinary and taboo sacrificial attack didn't just ignite the enemy, it consumed part of the wielder's own flesh and bone, reducing it to charcoal to power a searing, blade-shaped explosion. At its core, this broken way was a high-tier, self-sacrificing art so destructive that it had long been outlawed. Under the onslaught of that conflagration, everything within its radius, trees, grass, even the very air, was incinerated. The landscape itself seemed to split open, revealing a gaping wound in reality. Around the rift, space twisted and warped, as if pulled by some unseen force. From this maelstrom of distortion and flame rose a colossal blade, its burnished curve arching skyward. It radiated a blinding, fiery light that turned the heavens crimson, as though the entire sky were being reduced to ash. Watching it all, Ethan felt the ground tremble beneath him. He had heard legends of Yamamoto's forbidden arts, but to witness one-blade cremation firsthand was to confront destruction incarnate. And now, with that living inferno looming above, he realized there might be no defense against its wrath. The sky itself seemed ablaze, an immense blade of fire slicing through the darkness, its searing red light bathing everything in its path. Dozens of kilometers away, terrified onlookers could still make out its volcanic form, a living scarlet torrent that reduced all it touched to ash or molten slag. Victims caught in its sweep vanished in an instant, their bodies consumed without a trace, even the hardest metals liquefied and pooled at its feet. At the heart of this inferno stood Yuhabak. He could feel the flame's savage heat leeching away his strength, each breath a struggle against the blaze that threatened to obliterate him. Death hovered close, yet resignation was not in his nature. Summoning every ounce of will, he reached inward, drawing countless restless spirits into his core. Though the fire clawed at his flesh and the air around him crackled with destruction, Yuhabak planted his feet and braced himself. He would not be extinguished so easily. Countless rigid lines snaked across Ethan's skin, the first sign of his static bloodsuit activating. As one of the Quincy's most formidable defenses, it could withstand the worst of the flames, but not indefinitely. The enemy's blade burned too fiercely, eating away at the suit's protective barrier. Realizing he needed more, Ethan plunged deeper into his own reishi reserves. The dark veins on his body flared to brilliant light, pulsing outward until they wove together into a perfect hemispherical dome. This was the suit's outer shell, an extended, amplified version of the static bloodsuit, etched with ancient Quincy runes. Encased within, Ethan felt the heat fade to a distant roar. The shield was more than just an impenetrable barrier. Its corrosive aura ate away at anything that grazed it, tearing free both matter and energy and converting them back into reishi under Ethan's command. Secure in his glowing fortress, he braced himself for the next strike. Even such a formidable defense proved all too fragile against Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni's cremation blade. The instant that living flame met the outer shell of the blood-static suit, it was as if a fuse had detonated. An instant, violent reaction that went far beyond mere burning. The fire writhed and seethed like a hungry beast, corroding every inch of armor with relentless ferocity. Its heat threatened to liquefy the metal itself, peeling away the suit's protective layers one by one. Tiny hairline cracks snaked across the surface, almost invisible at first, but with every passing second, they multiplied and widened, as though a gaping maw were about to rend the suit in two. Ewok's pupils constricted in sudden alarm. He had never imagined an assault with such devastating power. Ethan had always trusted the impenetrable strength of his static bloodsuit, certain it could shrug off any assault. But now, before his very eyes, that confidence was shattered as the searing flame blade tore through his defenses. The fire roared to life, scorching the suit in an instant, and then, just as suddenly, it vanished without a trace. What remained was far more terrifying than any lingering blaze. Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni's body lay in ruin, reduced almost entirely to blackened charcoal. Only his skull and two hollow eye sockets remained recognizable, a grim testament to the blade's devastating power. Chapter 794. Kyoraku Shunsui takes the throne. Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni had paid an enormous price to strike that blow. He not only exhausted nearly all his spiritual energy, but also poured the last of his physical strength into the flaming blade. His unwavering resolve and selfless courage were nothing short of awe-inspiring. Before him, Yuach's scorched cloak curled into ash in the blade's lingering heat, revealing a blood-soaked form beneath. The once resplendent bloodsuit lay tattered and dull, its fabric shredded to expose gruesome wounds. Some gashes still trickled crimson, others were sealed by dark, crusted scabs. "Haswald!" Iwak roared, tearing his gaze from Yamamoto to scan the battlefield. "Report to me at once." Through the smoke and falling embers, Haswald staggered forward. His face was streaked with soot and sweat, his body marred by countless scars, but despite every visible injury, he stood upright and met Yuach's eyes without hesitation. "I'm unhurt, Your Majesty," he reported, voice steady even as he caught his breath. "I was simply caught off guard." Yuach inclined his head in approval. He knew better than anyone that if Haswald still stood at his side amid such carnage, the lieutenant's skill and resilience were beyond question. "Yuan Liuzhai," Yuach's voice boomed over the shattered remains of the battlefield. He stared down at the fallen figure before him, the once proud Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni, the strongest of all Soul Reapers. Now he lay motionless on scorched earth, his legendary authority reduced to silence. A bitter light still glimmered in the old man's eyes, but not a muscle moved in his body. With a slight raise of his hand, Yuach gathered an immense spiritual pressure that crackled like a thunderhead ready to burst. At his command, it detonated in a blinding shockwave, rippling across the field in a storm of energy. Yamamoto's battered form disintegrated instantly, turning to ash that scattered on the wind, no trace left behind. Yuach's gaze shifted toward the silhouette of Seirete in the distance. His plan was simple: eradicate the Soul Reaper headquarters and shatter the very foundation of their world so they could never again threaten the Quincy. Among the onlookers, Team Zero members stood frozen in stunned silence. Their faces, pale with disbelief, reflected the magnitude of what they had just witnessed and the peril that still lay ahead. Chapter 7. The Tipping Point. Ethan's eyes widened as the report reached Team Zero's command post. "I never imagined Yuach could take down Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni," he murmured, disbelief tinging his voice. Around him, seasoned warriors exchanged stunned glances. In all their years of battle, only one soul had ever been deemed Yamamoto's equal: Commander Ichibei. Yet here was proof that even the strongest Soul Reaper had fallen. What they didn't grasp, however, was that this moment, strange though it seemed, offered their best chance to strike back. Yuach had not yet opened the all-seeing eyes he wore as the Quincy King, the power to peer into every possible future and devise an unerring plan. But tapping that gift before its time carried a gruesome price. Legends told of how the sealed Quincy monarch had labored 9 centuries just to restore a heartbeat. 90 more years passed before his consciousness returned. Another 9 years were required to reclaim his full strength, and then, astonishingly, he conquered the world in 9 days. At each stage, his might crept steadily back. If he unlocked those eyes too early, before the 9 years of power had fully run their course, every last vestige of the star-crossed knight's abilities would be utterly drained. Now, with Yamamoto's fall shaking the very foundations of the Soul Society, Team Zero realized the hour of reckoning had come. They had to move fast, before Yuach dared to unleash his true omnipotence. Not even the lowest-ranking Quincy would be spared. Ethan's strike on Seirete served 2 purposes: to erase the future he'd seen, and to guard Ag against any move from the world of the gods. In a secluded corner of the hidden palace, Captain Shunsui Kyoraku pressed his hands to the brim of his straw hat, his face a mask of disbelief. Captain Genryusai Yamamoto, mentor, father figure, guiding star, had fallen. Shunsui could hardly accept it. "Captain." His voice trembled with grief and anger. He could not imagine the Seirete without Yamamoto's steady presence. It was as if his very sky had caved in. Though he'd been personally trained by Yamamoto to succeed him, Shunsui had always believed such a day lay far in the future. Now it had come all too soon. Sensei! Jushiro Utake stood nearby, eyes wide with shock. The invincible, fearsome Yamamoto, gone. How could it be? They looked at each other, hearts pounding. The world they knew had shattered, and nothing would ever be the same. Despite their fierce resolve, the other Shinigami captains were reaching the end of their endurance. It wasn't just the exhaustion and wounds of battle wearing them down. It was the shattering of the pillar in their hearts, the very belief that fueled their power. At this darkest hour, despair threatened to overwhelm them. Suddenly, Captain Kyoraku Shunsui rose to his feet. He knew there was no time for grief. Facing the triumphant Knights of the Star-Cross and the Quincy Saint soldiers, he understood that without swift action, more lives would be lost. Drawing on every ounce of strength, he unleashed his Tentekura technique to broadcast a single, unwavering command to every Shinigami: retreat. His voice rang out firm and resolute, and in its stead, hope and courage ignited within the ranks. Yet Kyoraku's order was not simply a call to fall back. He was all too aware that if the Shinigami withdrew en masse, their enemies would pursue without mercy. In that pursuit, few would stand a chance of escape. Determined to save as many souls as possible, he prepared to lead them through the gauntlet, however slim the odds. Captain Kyoraku Shunsui made a grim but necessary decision. A handful of Shinigami would stay behind to hold off the enemy. It was a harsh choice, sending comrades into the fray to secure the rest's escape, but it was the only way to buy the precious time they needed. Without hesitation, Shunsui issued the order. The 11th Division's combat squad was small, yet every warrior answered the call. "Don't worry," one officer said, voice steady. "We'll make sure the enemy can't follow you, not if they have to get through us first." Far from shrinking at the thought of sacrifice, the soldiers of the 11th Division stood proud. They were born for battles like this, and none would falter now. Alongside them, a handful of support team Shinigami readied their weapons, while medics from the 4th Division stayed close by, prepared to tend to any who fell. Together, they formed a living shield, a final stand to give their allies the chance to live and fight another day. Chapter 795, The Delayed Shadow-Invading Drug. Yuach still hadn't fully regained his strength, so he remained inside the Ice Palace, confined to the boundaries of the Shadow Realm and unaffected by Aizen Sosuke's manipulations. After dealing with Genryusai Shigegamamoto, he returned to his inner sanctum, eager only to rest and indifferent to the surviving Shinigami outside. His withdrawal granted the Soul Reapers a crucial reprieve. As the captains made their retreat, those stripped of their swastika marks were consumed by shame and fury. The power they had once worn like a badge of honor had been so casually wrenched away, and their wounded pride burned hotter than any Zanpakuto release. Still, reason prevailed. This was no time for suicidal heroics. With the Quincy's regrouping, any further resistance risked total annihilation. Survival, plain and simple, became their only objective. Across the barren ice fields, scattered groups of Shinigami, captains, lieutenants, and third seats alike, raced for safety like headless birds. Each struggled to stifle the urge for vengeance, focusing instead on one thing: escape. In that moment, Yuach's mercy, however grudging, offered the faintest glimmer of hope. If they could just make it through this night, they vowed, they would find a way to turn the tide. Ethan and his companions had no idea what awaited them beyond the horizon. All they knew was that they had to escape this deadly battlefield as quickly as possible. The Quincy aristocracy made no effort to finish off the incapacitated death captains. They were no longer a threat. Instead, their true quarry was the still active Shinigami who dared to stand against them. It took only moments for every remaining Soul Reaper to be swept from the field. Meanwhile, Haschwalth, vice-captain to the Quincy King, marshaled a relentless pursuit force to hunt down these wounded gods of death. Though diminished, they still harbored enough power to be dangerous, and could not be dismissed lightly. Yet even Haschwalth knew that slaying desperate foes was a secondary concern. Their ultimate aim was to hold the line until His Majesty Yuach had fully restored his might. Once Yuach's power returned, the Soul Society would be utterly powerless to oppose him. As for the realm of the gods, the Quincy deliberately looked the other way. They knew that atop that celestial throne sat the omniscient, omnipotent God King, and provoking him could invite untold catastrophe. Still, even among the gods, there were fanatics and warmongers whose thirst for conflict rivaled that of the Quincy themselves. It didn't mean they couldn't choose to provoke their enemies if they wanted to. Far above the divine realm, Aizen Sosuke stood lost in thought. A subtle pressure weighed on him, an unseen force that curbed his power and kept him from revealing his true strength. He had transcended death by merging with Kyoka Suigetsu, and his abilities should have been boundless. Yet now, inexplicably, he felt confined. Just then, a tremendous surge of Reiatsu swept in from the Seirete. It was unmistakably the spiritual pressure of Captain Commander Jamirusai Shigekuni Yamamoto. When fully unleashed, it could blanket the entire Soul Society. Aizen's own Reiatsu flared in response, matching Yamamoto's intensity and even eclipsing it in certain aspects. This immense Reiatsu, Aizen murmured, narrowing his eyes. He probed deeper and realized that something was amiss. Layered beneath Yamamoto's power was a second, entirely different Reiatsu, potent, inscrutable, and laden with an aura unlike anything he'd sensed before. Almost immediately, Aizen knew who it must be. Yuak, the king of the Quincy. Aizen allowed himself the faintest smile. Wherever Yuak's presence was felt, history itself trembled, and now, it seemed, that distant tremor had reached him. With his captivation broken, Aizen straightened, determination sparking behind his cold eyes. The real game was about to begin. Ethan had once used Kyoka Suigetsu's power to enter the Great Spirit Book Corridor, the repository of Soul Society's entire history. Through it, he'd learned of Yuak, the legendary founder of the Quincy. King of the Quincy? Aizen Sosuke murmured, a playful smile curving his lips. He found himself intrigued by this fabled adversary, all the more so because his spiritual pressure was now visibly waning. In Aizen's senses, it still stood tall like a pillar of fire, but the flame was dying down. Captain Yamamoto. The name drew a silent sigh from Aizen. He had never imagined he'd witness the defeat of such a storied warrior, at least not yet. Still, it mattered little to him personally. What truly piqued his interest was that, as soon as he ascended to become the god of destruction and shattered his current limits, he could observe these events directly. Besides, the God King himself seemed far too easygoing to concern himself with petty conflicts, small sparks here or there that might set the Quincy at odds with a newly born deity of annihilation. Aizen had begun a private inquiry into Esdeath's extraordinary abilities. She was the only person allowed to stand before the God King in person. Anyone else who dared approach the God King's hall would have their powers stripped away, not their lives, but every ounce of spiritual energy. It was a punishment more cruel than death, for to recover what was lost, one would have to rebuild from nothing, unless the God King himself granted an exception. Aizen couldn't say exactly what set Esdeath apart, but he knew her strength rivaled that of a god of destruction. He suspected she might even border on that divine threshold. Across the realm, Unohana-Retsu's hand trembled as she felt the shockwave of Yamamoto Genryu Saishiguni's defeat. "What happened?" she murmured, alarm tagging every word. There had been no warning, no sign that a god of destruction was targeting Seirete. Yet here was the unmistakable proof. Their greatest captain had fallen. For a moment, Unohana teetered on disbelief. But confusion quickly gave way to grim acceptance. Death did not discriminate by rank or reputation. Even a legend like Yamamoto was not immune. She only sighed that yet another acquaintance had died, and soon no one would even know her age. The gods themselves paid no mind to the upheavals in Seirete. Such affairs lay far beneath their concern. Meanwhile, the scattered Shinigami who had escaped the chaos gathered once more beneath Shunsui Kyoraku's banner. No sooner had Kisuke Urahara returned from the human world than he produced a small vial and passed it around. "What's this?" Kyoraku asked, studying the glass container. "It's what I call the shadow virus," Urahara replied. "It infiltrates an opponent's shadow and stops them from activating Bankai." Kyoraku frowned, clearly puzzled. "Why would we need that?" Urahara folded his arms, a thoughtful look in his eyes. "Because I've been wondering about Arankar Zanpakuto releases. They possess Shikai and Bankai equivalents just like Soul Reapers, yet the Quincy never managed to steal an Arankar's full release. So I stayed behind in Hueco Mundo to find out why. He glanced at each of them in turn. The clue came during the battle between Ichigo and Giselle. You remember how Giselle, who can absorb any spiritual particle, tasted an elderly Soul Reaper's Reiatsu and turned utterly disgusted? That reaction, and a few hushed remarks I overheard, convinced me of this. Quincy physiology simply can't handle an Arrancar's complete blade release. Their Oswellen may be powerful, but it isn't compatible with that kind of Reiatsu. A charged silence fell over the group as Urahara's words sank in. If his theory was correct, this little vial might be their only safeguard against an enemy's final devastating form. Ethan knew that the Quincy were utterly defenseless against hollows. Any trace of their dark energy was toxic to Quincy physiology. That's why the so-called shadow-invading poison was developed. It allowed captains to absorb a small measure of hollow power and fuse it into their Bankai, effectively hollowifying their ultimate form. By forcing Quincy's to ingest their Bankai alongside this poison, the old method of weapon confiscation became unreliable. After all, a Shinigami Zanpakuto resonates with the purity of its wielder's soul, and it will reject any taint of corrupt hollow essence. Chapter 796, Soul Society Guerrillas. When a Shinigami absorbs hollow power, the swastika becomes subtly hollowed, like a toxin seeping in. A Shinigami can withstand it, but a Quincy possessing no natural immunity would be utterly overwhelmed. Sooner or later, willingly or not, the stolen swastika must be returned. Urahara Kisuke stood before the assembled captains. With a casual flick of his sleeve, as if channeling some hidden magic, small black pills slid out and landed softly in each hand. They were unlike any ordinary medicine, radiating a cold, menacing aura. "What are these?" the captains asked in unison, exchanging startled looks. Urahara's lips curved into a confident, knowing smile. In a calm, steady voice, he announced, "These are shadow-reclaiming pills. Once ingested, they force any absconded swastika to return to its original wielder." At his words, relief and resolve lit up every face in the room. Wasn't the reason they'd been forced to retreat in our last engagement that the enemy learned to seize our Zanpakuto? For captains, our swords are the wellspring of our strength, and without them, we're like tigers bereft of claws, unable to fight at full power. "This can't be!" Captain Nirvana exploded, his voice thick with shock. As commander of the 12th Division, he had poured every ounce of energy into studying arcane technologies and medicinal concoctions. Yet in that moment, he realized how far behind he'd fallen compared to Urahara Kisuke. Grabbing a vial of the so-called shadow-invading elixir, he held it up, eyes desperate as he tried to discern its hidden mechanism. Urahara Kisuke paid him little mind. Casting a cool glance at Nirvana, he faced the other captains and continued, "The secret of the shadow-invading elixir lies in harnessing the power of the void." Captain Shunsui Kyoraku's ever-present smile vanished, replaced by grave concern. "Kisuke," he asked, voice low, "what are the side effects of this pill?" Urahara Kisuke tipped the brim of his hat down to obscure his eyes, as though unwilling to reveal his true expression. "It will let you slip through the barrier," he said solemnly, "but it comes at a cost. Your body will be partially weakened." A heavy silence fell over the gathered captains. As Soul Reapers, hollow hunters sworn to protect the balance, they had never willingly risked their own strength. Yet facing the might of the Wandenreich, they had no alternative. Toshiro Hitsugaya, the youngest among them, did not hesitate. He knew his own ice-based powers were the least potent of the captains, and without this shadow pass, he stood no chance against the Quincy. With steely determination, he swallowed the pill. The moment it dissolved, a fierce burning pain shot through his chest. He clenched his teeth, stifling any sound, and focused on the mission ahead. Ethan's face split open as a white, bone-like mask crept across it, covering half his features in a chilling shell. Inside him, his spiritual pressure convulsed, raw and untamed, until, imperceptibly, it found balance. When it did, a fierce determination ignited in his eyes. He could feel his strength surging back, stronger than before, and he knew he was ready to face the Quincy again. "Now we can keep fighting," he whispered, his voice hoarse but unwavering. Ink-black veins had stained the whites of his eyes, a sign that his body was overtaxed, on the verge of breaking down, but it was also proof of the power he'd reclaimed. Watching Ethan endure, several of their comrades steeled themselves and swallowed the shadow infusion drug, fully aware of its cost. It was a desperate gamble, but the only way to stand toe-to-toe with the Quincy and protect everything they held dear. Others, however, balked. They rejected the offer outright, and even Kisuke Urahara, scratching his cane against the ground, could not force them to change their minds. But Ethan's resolve was contagious, and those who chose to follow him braced themselves for the battle ahead. Captain Kyoraku Shunsui let out a relieved sigh as Urahara Kisuke's mask army arrived, last. The defected Shinigami captains, lieutenant captains, and hollow priests marching beside them were no lightweights. They more than made up for Seireite's current shortage of frontline fighters. Deputy Captain Hitsugaya Toshiro studied Kyoraku with a questioning look. "Captain, what's our next move?" Kyoraku tugged his bamboo hat a little lower and offered a knowing grin. "They forced us into the shadows before. Now, it's our turn. We'll hold tight within Soul Society, strike when the moment's right, and bleed them dry until they can't carry out a single plan." He glanced at the assembled officers. "Meanwhile, we must sharpen our intelligence network, track every enemy step, decipher every intention, and devise tactics that hit them where it hurts most. Nirvana, your scientific expertise will be invaluable. Make sure we have every piece of data at our fingertips." With that, Kyoraku folded his arms, eyes alight with anticipation. The battle for the Seireite's future was about to begin. "I hope you can develop new technologies against the Quincy as soon as possible," Shunsui Kyoraku said. "We need to cut our casualties and increase our battlefield effectiveness." But Ethan paid him little heed. He was already bent over the vial of shadow infection serum that Urahara Kisuke had brought in. After tracing every reaction pathway, he sighed. "It's potent all right, but the side effects are too severe." Captain Mayuri Kuroda met Ethan's assessment with a frosty smile. "Then leave it to me. I'll formulate a safer alternative, one that neutralizes the enemy's ability to hijack our Bankai without wreaking havoc on the user." "Very well," Shunsui replied, nodding. "Captain Kuroda, this is yours to handle." "I'll gather the necessary reagents immediately," Mayuri added, already turning on his heel. His mind raced with countless microscopic tweaks and experimental protocols. In the coming clash, raw power would be matched against scientific ingenuity, and he fully intended to tilt the balance. As he strode off, Ethan watched him go. With so many Quincy at their disposal for testing, Mayuri's arsenal of anti-Quincy measures was sure to grow, and soon. Ethan was certain he could resolve the Quincy problem more quickly than Urahara Kisuke. Once Mayuri Kuroda had taken his leave, Shunsui Kyoraku stood watching Urahara's masked army from the living world. A profound sense of relief washed over him. Those death captains, vice captains, and Kido masters who had once defected were now a formidable bulwark against any external threat. Chapter 797, The Three-Legged Triangle. The fallout from the Aizen Sosuke affair had thrown the Soul Society into its gravest crisis yet. In the chaos that followed, a group of once honored captains and lieutenants, branded the Masked Army, had been driven into exile by betrayal and misunderstanding. Leading them was Ethan, a distinguished former captain whose loyalty had been unjustly called into question. Banished from the very realm he had sworn to defend, Ethan and his comrades watched in anguish as the Soul Society teetered on the brink of collapse. But time, as ever, revealed the truth. Investigation after investigation cleared their names, and the Soul Society's elders finally acknowledged the grave error. What had once been a stain on their honor was expunged. Their grievances were officially redressed, and they were no longer fugitives from their homeland. Now restored in reputation, the Masked Army stood ready to aid the realm they loved, but not against the threat they had anticipated. The true enemy was not hidden within the Seireite's walls. It was the resurgent Quincy faction, whose bold machinations threatened to upend the balance of souls itself. Captain Commander Kyoraku Shunsui recognized at once the critical advantage Ethan and his veterans could provide. He dispatched emissaries to open a dialogue, personally urging their return to the fold. "The Soul Society is in dire need of elite combatants," he told them. "Your experience as former captains and lieutenants is exactly what we require to halt the Quincy uprising. Your honor has been restored. There is no longer any stain upon your names. Stand with us once more, not as outcasts, but as defenders of this world." Ethan listened to Kyoraku's plea, the weight of his former vows stirring within him. The path to redemption lay clear before him. Side by side with the Soul Society's finest, he would help forge the three-legged triangle of allies destined to resist the Quincy threat and ensure that the realm remained safe for all souls. Ethan stood among the gathered members of the Masked Corps as Captain Shunsui Kyoraku unveiled his proposal. They would return to the Soul Society and renew their sworn duty to protect its peace. A murmur of excitement rippled through the ranks. None had wanted more than to set foot again within its walls and serve alongside the Shinigami they admired. Now, at last, the chance had come, and no one was going to let it slip away. Through Shunsui's deft negotiations, the two sides hammered out an agreement. The Masked Corps would formally rejoin the Soul Society, taking up arms in the next decisive battle. On the surface, Shunsui appeared unruffled, even triumphant, but beneath that easy smile lay the weight of a grim reality. With Retsu Unohana, Kenpachi Zaraki, and Genryusai Yamamoto Shigekuni all gone, the Soul Society's might had been halved almost overnight. What remained were a handful of veteran captains, himself included, and a group of raw recruits still untested in true combat. None could yet claim unquestioned strength. Ethan felt the tension in the air. Their return would bolster the ranks, yes, but could they truly make up for the loss of those three legends? Even as hope flared at the prospect of fighting side by side with old allies, he knew the coming war would demand everything they had and more. Still, with Shunsui leading the charge and the Masked Corps back in the fold, the Soul Society's light might just be rekindled after its darkest hour. Captain Shunsui Kyoraku's strength was legendary, but he knew all too well he still fell short of Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni's power. Facing a behemoth like the Invisible Empire with his current abilities felt like smashing a mountain with an eggshell. Yet Shunsui never considered retreat. A fierce, unquenchable fire burned in his soul. All the same, Jushiro Ukitake's condition was steadily worsening. Even the most indomitable fighting spirit could not fuel an endless battle, and a crushing helplessness pressed upon Shunsui's chest like a boulder, threatening to steal his breath. He forced himself to remember his duty. As captain, he could not collapse, and he could not allow despair to spread among his comrades. With the Soul Palace lost, there was no way to leverage the Worm Nest's prisoners. So Shunsui turned his gaze elsewhere, towards Soul City and the realm of the gods. Could he call on divine aid? Not yet, but it would remain in reserve as a contingency plan. In response to the escalating crisis, Captain Kyoraku Shunsui of the 13th Division adopted a series of unorthodox measures to restore the cold, efficient fighting style of the original Killing Division. In these turbulent times, he believed, only by evolving could they hope to survive. Shunsui personally mapped out a detailed battle plan, deploying every available asset to create elaborate trap lines and ambush sites, carefully baited to lure the Quincy into a deadly snare. Central to his strategy was Captain Mayuri Kurotsuchi, the Gotei 13's resident mad scientist. With his uncanny intellect and cutting-edge research, Mayuri engineered a suite of specialized weapons and devices designed specifically to counter the Quincy's unique energy manipulation. These innovations dramatically increased the Soul Reaper's combat effectiveness. As Shunsui predicted, the pursuing Quincy forces marched right into the prearranged kill zones. In the ensuing chaos, Mayuri's research team moved with cold precision. They immobilized each Quincy operant, secured them with experimental restraints, and hauled them back to the 13th Division's laboratories for in-depth analysis. With every captive studied, Shunsui's gamble on unorthodox tactics edged the Soul Society one step closer to turning the tide of war. Ethan watched from the shadows as Mayuri Kurotsuchi's eyes gleamed with fanatical light, an eerie glow that seemed to pierce the very mysteries of life and bend death itself into a weapon for the Soul Society. Each fallen Quincy dissected in Mayuri's laboratory yielded priceless intelligence, laying the groundwork for ever more precise battle plans. Ethan knew that anyone captured by the mad scientist would stand no chance of survival. Aware of this grim reality, Haschwald had strictly forbidden any rescue attempts for their missing brethren. Instead, he ordered every Quincy to vanish into the depths of the Invisible Empire. They feared that if the Shinigami seized even one captive, they would exploit the intelligence to strike at Ewok himself. And if the Almighty fell prematurely, all hope would be lost. Better to disappear completely, they concluded, than to risk provoking the Soul Society or endangering their leader's very life. In the silence of the Invisible Empire, they vanished, eliminating every threat for the sake of their future. When Shunsui Kyoraku learned that Haschwald hadn't sent reinforcements to rescue the missing Quincy's, but had instead hired the entire Invisible Empire as a defensive force, he was seized by confusion and suspicion. Such an unusual move had to conceal a deeper motive. After all, in terms of sheer power, the Quincy defenders were more than a match for the Soul Society. Even without Ewok, the Sternkreuz Knights were renowned for their battlefield prowess. There was no logical reason to entrust our dispatched troops to their care. The Sternkreuz Knights alone rival the strength of the strongest Soul Reaper captains. In one-on-one combat, even a team of captains would struggle to defeat them. Numbering nearly 30, these Quincy warriors each wield a shrift, granting them abilities on par with, or surpassing, captain-level Shinigami. Aside from a tendency to underestimate their opponents, they have virtually no weaknesses. By contrast, the 13th Division is now severely depleted. If the Knights strike with full force, or even commit most of their number, they could easily overwhelm the weakened squad and drive them from the field. Kyoraku Shunsui leaned back in his chair, swirling a cup of sake as he studied the latest intelligence reports. "So here's the situation," he began. "Ewok isn't deploying reinforcements because he's still recuperating his strength, and his people are afraid the Soul King's realm will strike back if they push any further." Mayuri Kurotsuchi tapped a slender finger against a datapad. "Our Quincy prisoners confirmed it. Ewok has retreated into seclusion to rebuild his Reiatsu. His commanders won't commit more troops for fear of divine retaliation." Urahara Kisuke gave a thoughtful nod. "Which means we can't launch a full-scale assault on the Wandenreich. It'd be like smashing an iron fortress with a wooden mallet." Shunsui folded his fan shut with a soft click and let it rest in his palm. He met their gazes, a spark of determination in his eyes. "Exactly. Knowing their current weakness is one thing, but charging in head-on would be suicide. We need to turn this to our advantage with a more subtle approach." With that, the three captains bent over the battle map, beginning to weave the first threads of a strategy that would strike at Ewok's empire without ever touching its walls. Chapter 798, Assassination Team. Only once Ewok retired to sleep did he assume the mantle of the father of the Quincy and draw upon the wellspring of his power, rigorously forbidding any disturbance during those hours of rest. Yet when Captain Shunsui Kyoraku uncovered the true scope of the Invisible Empire's Quincy forces, he realized that a direct clash with Ewok's virtually unassailable might would be no more effective than smashing a mountain with an eggshell. Their only hope lay in striking at the very roots of his strength. Secretly, Shunsui devised an unprecedented assassination campaign, thin the Quincy ranks, and deprive Ewok of the future power he so desperately needed to rebuild. At the heart of this operation, he placed two of the Gotei's most seasoned covert agents, Captain Soi Fong and Commander Yoriichi Shihoin. Moving with the silence and precision of wraiths, they slipped past the Empire's defenses under cover of darkness, each successful strike delivering a crippling blow to Ewok's ambitions. They would spare nothing in pursuit of this seemingly impossible mission. Ethan stood quietly in the cavern's dim light as Shunsui Kyoraku laid out the final details of the assault. To ensure every facet of the mission was covered, Shunsui had mobilized dozens of Shinigami as auxiliary forces, each squad with its own specialty. Some would infiltrate deep into Hueco Mundo to gather intelligence. Others would stage feints and distractions to draw enemy attention away from the main thrust. The remainder would be on hand to provide support or cover our retreat should things go awry. Every maneuver had been mapped out and drilled to perfection. The plan was as intricate as a spider's web, with overlapping contingencies to catch any thread that might snap. None of them could be sure the operation would succeed, but they'd done everything within their power to tip the scales in their favor. After all, Hueco Mundo was no longer a stable stronghold. They couldn't count on the Arrancar, most of whom had either ascended into ordinary godhood or fallen in battle. Even the Invisible Empire's own Hueco Mundo task force, a specialized team sent to round up hollows and Arrancar deemed fit for service, had met unexpected resistance. They clashed with the common gods of the god world and were soundly beaten. Without access to destructive ki, those so-called ordinary gods proved shockingly vulnerable. When Kenpachi Zaraki caught wind of that defeat, he didn't hesitate. He and his squad plunged headlong into Hueco Mundo, seeing it as both a hunting ground and a chance to test their strength. Word had spread quickly. Hueco Mundo had effectively become a province of the god world, rife with half-awakened deities and prey waiting to be challenged. Ethan drew a steadying breath. The stage was set, the players were in place. Now it was a matter of timing, courage, and the unforgiving crucible of war. If they executed Shunsui's plan flawlessly, they just might wrest control of Hueco Mundo back from godly hands and survive to tell the tale. Chapter 7: Shadows and Cloaks. The upheaval in Soul Society deepened by the day, yet the realm of the gods remained oddly silent. No aid, no interference. Meanwhile, Kenpachi Zaraki had single-handedly torn the Hueco Mundo hunting squad to shreds, and Hashwood's link to the Quincy had gone dark once more. Even he couldn't ignore the creeping sense of doom settling over every captain and lieutenant. Adding insult to injury, the covert assassination team led by Captain Soi Fong and Yoruichi Shihoin was inflicting wave after wave of chaos within enemy territory. Soi Fong was positively thrilled to be paired with Yoruichi again. As the senior captain, she'd long since moved past her old grudge over Yoruichi's earlier desertion. Nothing mattered more than a flawless mission. Fueled by excitement, Soi Fong resolved to push herself well beyond her usual limits. Before setting out, Yoruichi casually drew 2 jet-black cloaks from her satchel. "Urahara Kisuke made these," she explained, running a nier across the sleek fabric. "They'll conceal your Reiatsu signature and mask every stray spirit particle." Soi Fong folded her arms. "From Urahara Kisuke, of all people?" she said, skeptical but curious. "Trust me," Yoruichi said with that trademark grin. "You don't want to go in unguarded." Neither woman needed to coordinate their every step. They had a clear objective and the freedom to strike independently. Still, they both slipped on the cloaks without hesitation. The instant Soi Fong adjusted the hood and drew the fabric around her, she felt her presence slip away, melding perfectly with the night's shadows. When she peeked out again, her Reiatsu had vanished from the spiritual sensors she'd tested. Not even the keenest Soul Reaper could pinpoint her. Awe flickered across her face. "Incredible," she whispered. "Exactly," Yoruichi replied softly. "Tonight, we're ghosts." Stepping into the moonlit darkness, the 2 captains vanished without a trace, ready to strike, complete their assignment, and disappear once more into the silent void. Ethan barely registered the attack before it was over. The Soul Reapers struck so swiftly that he saw nothing. No warning flash of light, no heralding shout, only the last, searing pain before he fell to his knees. There was simply no time to mount a defense. Ahead of him lay the Ice Palace, the Wandenreich's greatest stronghold. Its walls were hewn from living glacier, pale blue and impossibly smooth, like a shard of winter set against the sky. At the main entrance rose 2 broken arches of ivory-like ice, each sculpted to resemble a shattered tusk. Beyond the palace proper stood a smaller building adorned with a cross motif, and below the hill, a sprawling complex capped by a colossal clock tower, its face frozen in time by layers of rime. Inside the palace throne room, Hashwald sat motionless, his expression carved from stone. He listened in grim silence as his lieutenants filed in to deliver their latest failure, number 107. Again and again, they had tried to ambush the Soul Reapers, only to be outmaneuvered or cut down before they could strike. With each report, a wave of helplessness rolled through him. How did the Soul Reapers manage it? Night after night, they slipped past the Quincy's spirit detectors, masking their Reiatsu until they were upon them. They moved like ghosts, attacking from every angle and disappearing before any counterstrike could land. Even the Ice Palace's enchanted wards turned out to be no barrier against such stealthy assassins. Hashwald rubbed his temples. The Invisible Empire's defenses were legendary, yet here they were, beaten time and again by a handful of masked death gods. For the first time since his rise to power, he found himself without a strategy, without an answer, and most troubling of all, without hope that the next attempt would fare any better. For the Quincy, whose physiology is uniquely attuned to spirit particles, even the slightest Raryoku fluctuation was impossible to conceal. That all changed when two scientific visionaries, Kisuke Urahara and Mayuri Kurotsuchi, entered the conflict. Drawing on their exhaustive research into Quincy biology and spiritual principles, they devised a suite of cutting-edge devices and pharmaceuticals that could jam Quincy sensing and cloak a Shinigami's presence. Armed with Urahara's and Mayuri's inventions, the Shinigami slipped past Quincy detection as though they'd vanished into thin air, and carried out their missions with unprecedented speed and precision. Neither researcher spared expense or ethics in pursuit of victory. Live Quincies were kept alive for interrogation and experimentation, while the dead were dissected to unlock every secret of their physiology. After all, these were mortal enemies, and in their eyes no tactic was too extreme. As the covert assassinations multiplied, a heavy, suffocating tension settled over the Ice Palace and its surroundings, the air itself seeming to bristle with silent threat. The Quincy forces had finally grasped the severity of the threat against the plight. Mem tightened their vigilance and patrols across the invisible empire. Still, despite their best efforts, they could not stop the ghost-like infiltrations and lightning-swift raids carried out by the Shinigami. Every time an assassination succeeded, one or more Quincies fell, their life flames quietly snuffed out in the depths of night. "We can't stay on the defensive any longer," Haschwald thought, staring at the latest casualty reports. "If we don't find a way to strike back, the future of the Wandenreich is in serious jeopardy." Determined to turn the tide, Haschwald devised an elaborate trap, but it wasn't nearly as clever as he believed. Soifong and Yorichi saw straight through it. Both women were battle-hardened veterans. They knew better than to spring a trap that risked their lives needlessly. Instead, they adopted a simpler, more effective strategy: weaken the Quincy from within. There was no need for reckless gambits. So long as they remained patient, the Quincies would be unable to sustain their heightened alertness forever. Inevitably, someone would falter, and when that moment came, Soifong and Yorichi would strike. Far above the scars of battle, in the silent reaches of the Soul King's realm, Ethan stood over the sleeping form of Yuwatch. The once mighty Quincy King lay in an enchanted slumber, his breath steady and undisturbed. To an onlooker, he looked harmless, yet Ethan's orders were clear. He would lead a small team deep into this sacred domain to assassinate Yuwatch. Their success would force the Quincy King's hand, compelling him to unleash the Sankt-Zwinger long before he was ready, and then, driven by desperation and fury, he would march on the Soul King's palace itself. Ethan felt a flicker of anticipation at the plan's audacity. If it worked, the Wanderer in the shadows would compel Walk into a premature strike, an opening that the Shinigami could exploit far beyond anything they had managed so far. He took one last look at the sleeping king, tightened his grip on his weapon, and signaled his team forward. The game they were about to play would change everything. Ethan had piqued Ewok's curiosity more than anyone else. A tyrant like Ewok would never hesitate to sacrifice his underlings, and after basking in the life-giving sunlight that fueled his power, Ethan could sense the hunger finally sated. It was time to be sent off to other worlds. As for the junior Soul King and the Soul King candidate who'd spirited away Kurosaki Ichigo, Ethan suspected Ichigo wouldn't mind their intervention. And so, by the God King's command, a royal decree rang out across the divine realm, summoning every god to carry out his will. Chapter 799, Assault on the Invisible Empire and Seizure of the Soul Society. An order from the God King? Across the vast expanse of the god world, every deity felt it, the voice of absolute authority crackling in their minds like a bolt of lightning. Attack the Invisible Empire and seize dominion over the Soul Society. The command blazed into their thoughts unbidden, searingly clear and impossible to ignore. Some gods trembled in shock, others felt a thrill of excitement, and a few stood frozen in bewilderment. But none could deny its overwhelming power. Aizen Sosuke leaned back, a faint smile playing at his lips as he studied the ripples of agitation spreading among the assembled deities. "Fascinating," he murmured. issuing orders directly into every mind in the realm, not just a display of absolute power, but a declaration of one's very existence. This was no half-hearted decree from a distant spirit king. This was the unmistakable mark of an omniscient, omnipotent god king, an authority that brooked no challenge. Esdeath's eyes gleamed as Ethan's command echoed through her consciousness. Since arriving in this world, she had heard rumors of its greatest powers, the legendary Soul King, the fearsome Ewok, the elite Team Zero, and the enigmatic King of Hell, if he existed at all. Now, faced with such an undeniable demonstration of divine sovereignty, her blood raced with anticipation. Every god present felt the same surge of exhilaration and dread. The invisible empire, shrouded in mystery until now, would soon tremble beneath the might of the God King's will. And at its center stood Ethan, whose single thought had set the entire god world ablaze with purpose. The die was cast. The godly legions would march, and the fate of the Soul Society would be decided by the thunderous echo of one command. Team Zero had already witnessed it, the moment Aizen Sosuke's Honyo completed its fusion, leaving them all stunned. Nothing else mattered now. Everyone was eager to see just how formidable Ewok truly was. With Ethan's explicit authorization in hand, Esdeath could hardly contain her excitement to spearhead the assault on the Invisible Empire. This time around, no one volunteered to remain behind and guard the palace. After all, the Divine Gate stood secure, and the God King had issued no orders for a garrison. As the realm's sole god of destruction entrusted by the throne, Esdeath was the only one qualified to join the expedition. Without her, the others would be stuck on watch duty in the royal residence. Fearing that any hesitation might cost them the chance to fight, the entire army surged forward. By Ethan's command, we march at once. Our target, the Invisible Empire. Esdeath's voice thundered across the ranks. At her side, a mighty host of ordinary gods and fellow gods of destruction drew arms, and thus began their grand march to war. Ethan stood in the dimly lit strategy room of the Seireitei guerrilla headquarters, staring at the holomap of the realms. His fingers tapped nervously as he took in the latest intelligence. Soul City, the great citadel encircling the Soul Society, had become a magnet for wandering spirits. In the past weeks, hundreds of souls had risen to godhood, swelling the God Realm's newly formed army to over 2,000 warriors. Under the rallying cry of the God King, they now gathered like an unstoppable tide, their intention clear, to seize control of the Soul Society. Such an overt mobilization could not escape the notice of the Invisible Empire, and sure enough, its agents had already dispatched urgent reports to Imperial High Command. But for Ethan and his fellow Seireitei fighters, the God Realm's sudden aggression was equally baffling. This was a realm that had long maintained a cautious neutrality, so why all at once this show of force? "What are they planning?" murmured Lieutenant Hana at his side. Ethan's jaw clenched. Every instinct told him this was more than a mere border skirmish. All signs pointed toward a direct advance on the Invisible Empire's frontiers. And whatever, or the God King's true aim, the consequences would reshape the balance of power between all three worlds. "We can't afford to wait," Ethan said, straightening. "Send envoys to every contact we have in the God Realm. We need answers, and fast." As the war room erupted into controlled chaos, Ethan braced himself for the storm that was already rolling in. Yoruichi, our fastest Shunshin operative, was the only one capable of slipping behind enemy lines and returning with information in record time. At first, she flatly refused. After all, her mission would bring her face-to-face with either Unohana Retsu or Kenpachi Zaraki, hardly the sort of hands-on reconnaissance she relished. Still, pressed by circumstance, she departed in desperation. A short while later, she rendezvoused with Uozhua Li deep within enemy territory. He met her without hesitation and laid out the orders plainly. "The God King has commanded us to attack the Invisible Empire and then seize control of the Soul Society." Yoruichi's contact, Captain Yei, who had painstakingly infiltrated the God World's ranks, stared at Lai in disbelief. "You want to seize the Soul Society? I understand an assault on the Invisible Empire, but wresting rule of Soul Society, that's suicide. We'd make every Shinigami our sworn enemies." Lai gave her a calm, steady look. "The Soul King's delegates have abandoned their posts. In the eyes of the heavens, the Soul Society is now unclaimed territory, up for grabs by whoever has the strength to claim it. The God King intends to fold the Soul Society into his own realm. Yorichi's expression darkened. The Soul King was supposed to be their eternal guardian, the very embodiment of the god of death. To see him reduced to a political pawn left her cold with anger. Yet there was no time to protest. The gears of war had already been set in motion, and the fate of two worlds now hung in the balance. Chapter 5. The Fall of Soul Society. Ethan crouched atop the shattered remnants of the Great Seirete Gate, his heart pounding as Quincy forces swarmed through the breach. The familiar defenses of Soul Society had fallen. The Spirit King's decree no longer protected the realms of the Shinigami. Across the courtyard, Quincy crossbows rattled, and hordes of hollow-turned Quincy surged forward under the command of their transcendent leaders. Without Soul Society's barrier, the Shinigami had nowhere left to retreat. He turned to his lieutenant, Shi Fengyuan, who stared in disbelief at the ruined stone walls. "What are we supposed to do now?" she asked, voice trembling. Ethan tightened his grip on his Zanpakuto. "Regroup at the inner gates. Warn the captains." They slipped away under the cover of a collapsing cloud of Reiatsu, racing toward the central district where the captains convened. Soon, they found themselves before Grand Counselor Mao Jihua Li, whose cold gaze swept over the two young officers. "The Spirit King has lost control," Mao said evenly. "The Quincy occupy the realm, and now the God King prepares to claim Soul Society for himself." She swallowed. "Then there's no sanctuary for the Shinigami." Mao's lips curved into a faint, inscrutable smile. "You have two choices. Accept the title of God of Destruction and serve the king, or seek refuge in other worlds." Ethan exchanged a startled look with Shi. "Other worlds?" he echoed. "Realms beyond the spirit realm," Mao confirmed. "If you do not pledge your allegiance here, you must depart, and perhaps find a new purpose among distant lives." With those harsh alternatives laid before them, Ethan and Shi bowed and left the council chamber in stunned silence. As they hurried back through the broken corridors, Shi's shoulders sagged. "I never imagined it would come to this." "Neither did I," Ethan replied, "but we'll find a way." By nightfall, Ethan and Shi stood before Captain Commander Kyoraku Shunsui in his secluded quarters. The room was suffused with dim lantern light, and Shunsui's trademark smile was strained, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. Shunsui folded his arms. "So the council offers us service to the God King or exile." Shi exhaled sharply. "It feels like we have no choice. Either we become the king's enforcers, or we abandon the realm we swore to protect." Ethan stepped forward. "Captain, is there any other path? Can Queen Yuwak's Quincy be driven back? Can the God King be held at bay?" Shunsui shook his head, the smile vanishing entirely. "I wish I could say yes, but even the Quincy threat remains unresolved. And now the God of Destruction enters the fray, backed by the almighty Spirit King above them both. There's nothing we can do unless our own Spirit King deigns to descend and fight in person." He paused, rubbing his temples. "I've faced many battles in my time, but I fear this may be the greatest crisis Soul Society has ever known. And as your commander, I feel utterly helpless." She bowed his head. "Then what shall we do, Sensei?" Shunsui met their eyes, a bitter smile returning. "We cling to hope and loyalty. We'll seek allies, prepare our forces, and if need be, find that other world. But first, we gather every Shinigami we can and stand our ground, no matter the odds." Ethan and Shi exchanged determined glances. Together they vowed to fight on, even as the shadows of gods in Quincy converged over Soul Society. Ethan's heart pounded as he surveyed the enemy lines. Are we really going to clash with the God of Destruction to the very end? The thought nearly made him tremble. Though the Soul Society spanned untold leagues, the Invisible Empire lay surprisingly close to the Divine Realm, close enough that Esdieth and her God of Destruction Legion had arrived in record time. On this barren plain, just beyond the Empire's outer walls, Grandmaster Hashwald had already assembled his forces, and beside him stood Ethan, tense and ready. "God of Destruction," Hashwald called out, voice ringing across the field. "What brings you here?" Esdieth, astride a platform of crackling ice and reishi, regarded them with cool disdain. "We've come to seize dominion over the Soul Society." Before Hashwald or his captains could react, Esdieth lifted a single perfumed hand. Frost spilled from her fingertips, and dozens of her elite Quincy Saint soldiers materialized in midair. A scream of wind tore across the plain as they tumbled toward Haschwald's lines. At that moment, a roar shattered the charged silence. From the Soul Society's contingent, Captain Kenpachi Zaraki sprinted forward, wild grin splitting his face. "Ha! Who among you is strongest?" With a crazed laugh, he swung Nozarashi in a savage arc, cleaving 2 Quincy soldiers in half before they even had time to draw their bows. Nearby, Aizen Sosuke remained eerily still. His pale eyes flickered with amusement, or perhaps calculation. No one knew whether the man before them was Aizen's real body or merely another hypnotic projection, the infamous Mirage Blossom Water Moon at work once more. Whoever he was, he made no move to join the fray. Haschwald's lips curled into a snarl. "We cannot allow them to threaten His Majesty. Sternritter, Quincy's, annihilate them." He lifted his gauntleted hands, and a storm of black reishi spears erupted from the earth. Ethan gripped his glaive, resolve hardening like steel. The god of destruction had declared war on the Soul Society, and now every man, woman, and Quincy remaining would pay the price for standing in its way. Ethan knew better than anyone that the Quincy would never allow anyone to approach Ewok. Any attempt to interfere would cost them their lives. Steeling themselves, they threw everything into their assault on the so-called god of destruction. Yet when the dust settled, Ethan and his companions were stunned to find that his true strength fell far short of the legends. Chapter 800, God of Destruction versus Quincy. They might style themselves gods of destruction, but at heart they remain Quincy, beings defined by their heritage and bound by a bloodline legacy. Unlike true deities, Quincy derive all their power from spirit particles in the world around them. They draw in ambient reiatsu, refine it, and then wield it in 2 principal ways: to dismantle and absorb anything made of spiritual energy, or to starve soul reapers by denying them the very particles they need to form their reiatsu. Almost every Quincy can perform this basic absorption, but a rare few lack it entirely. These outliers possess instead the gift of soul-giving, a power they inherited from their progenitor Ewok. Rather than drawing spirit particles in, they bestow them upon others, an ability that stands in perfect opposition to the rest of their kind. Then there is the most formidable and most terrifying of all Quincy talents, Shengli's overwhelming technique. With a thought, a Quincy using this skill can instantly deconstruct a living body into its constituent spirit particles, then pull those particles inward, merging them with his own reiatsu. The victim doesn't merely die, they are consumed, their essence folded into the conqueror's power. In the aftermath, the Quincy's form shifts, skin and bone, taking on faint echoes of the one they absorbed, an eerie testament to their ultimate mastery of spirit clustering. This is the true face of Quincy might, not some divine prerogative of destruction, but the cold, clinical absorption of life itself, woven through a legacy of blood, spirit, and domination. Ordinary deities, Shinigami and Hollows alike, all share a fatal weakness when facing the Quincy, except for the enigmatic god of destruction. His power alone can nullify every Quincy ability. That power of destruction springs from the spirit core embedded within Ethan himself. No Quincy can absorb it unless the Spirit King personally intervenes, or unless Ewok, in his omniscience, finally uncovers its secret. Whether that secret can ever be unraveled remains to be seen. The moment the Quincy realized the god of destruction wasn't the invincible force they'd imagined, they turned merciless. A wave of slaughter swept through every realm. In the aftermath, many so-called gods of destruction have blended back into ordinary deities. True bearers of that power are now extraordinarily rare. It will take at least a millennium for them to reclaim their former might and rise to dominate the world. By then, every god of destruction could stand allied with the Quincy. Even so, had the 4 great factions, the Quincy, the Shinigami, the Perfection Masters, and the Hollows, ever united against him, they still could not prevail. For now, the struggle hangs in perfect balance, victory and defeat poised on a knife's edge. And yet it is precisely this stalemate that Ethan needs. Ethan knew that to become a god of destruction, he needed more than secluded study. He had to stare down life and death itself, igniting a resonance deep in his soul. Of the 2,000 ordinary gods, fewer than 2 ever attain that lofty rank, Yet one god of destruction was worth hundreds, even thousands of lesser deities. The moment Madarame's thunderous forward shattered the air, the battlefield ignited. Ethan's team, hearts ablaze with determination, surged forward like a hail of arrows aimed straight at the Invisible Empire's Quincy encampment. The acrid stench of gunpowder blended with the crackling tension of battle, and the standoff instantly erupted into a ferocious clash. But just as Ethan and his comrades were about to collide with the enemy lines, a blinding, lightning-fast beam cleaved the sky. No one saw where it came from. It tore through the air with such speed and brilliance that the entire charge ground to an abrupt halt. It blazed across the night sky like the brightest meteor, carrying a deadly force too swift for anyone to track or even react to. Wherever its beam swept, air itself seemed to tear open, leaving behind jagged cracks that shimmered with heat. When the light finally faded, the team froze in horror. One of their leaders, Madarame Ikaku, lay collapsed in a widening pool of blood. His right chest had been cleanly pierced by the beam, the impact nearly severing his torso. Blood spurted like a crimson fountain, staining the ground at his feet. His shattered right hand had fallen a few feet away, still clutching the soul blade as if refusing to let go. Ikaku! Ethan's shout rang out, equal parts disbelief and rage. He spun around, searching desperately for whoever or whatever had carried out the attack. Through the settling dust, he made out a lone figure, rising from the shadows. Clad in a white hooded cloak, the stranger moved with calm precision. On the back of the cloak gleamed an embroidered cross-star emblem, its silver threads catching the fading light of the setting sun. The symbol shone like a warning. This was no random assassin, but a hunter who had come prepared for war. The late afternoon wind whipped dust across the shattered courtyard as a lone figure strode forward. He removed his weathered hat, revealing a shock of purple hair, styled punk-sharp, and a cold smile slid across his lips. His eyes gleamed with absolute confidence, utterly free of fear. Corporal Ramirez swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. His voice shook as he called out, "Sir, who are you?" Quincy Busby chuckled, a low, mocking sound that rumbled like distant thunder. "My name isn't your concern," he said, his tone laced with dark amusement and magnetic authority. "What matters is that orders have come down to erase every one of you. I don't have time for idle introductions." His words cut into the squad like a blade, and an oppressive silence fell. Then Ethan, his teammate's comrade and friend, stepped forward. He drew a steadying breath, channeling every ounce of his inner spiritual power. In his hand, his soul blade flared to life, flooding the courtyard with brilliant, purifying light. "Not on my watch," Ethan growled, eyes burning with righteous fury. "You're not getting away with this." With that, he let out a roar and hurtled toward Busby, sword raised high, ready to fight for every life standing behind him. Each time Ethan swung his blade, he poured every ounce of his strength into the strike. He wanted nothing more than to end this battle quickly and avenge Madarame. Yet Busby remained unnervingly calm. With the slightest motion of his hand, he drew in the very essence of the sun, condensing it into a brilliant point on his fingertips. Then, in a flash, a beam of light, far hotter and more dazzling than before, erupted from his palm and slammed straight into Gongqin's chest. This was Busby's famed Solar Finger Y, a devastating technique said to reduce any target to ash instantly. Gongqin did his best to dodge, but he was just a fraction too slow. The searing beam cleaved through his defenses like death's own scythe, aiming directly for his heart. Most gods would have raised a magical barrier in that moment, but Gongqin, proud warrior of the 11th Division, refused to rely on such phantom tricks. Instead, he met the attack head-on, swinging his soul blade in a blazing arc. The blade split the solar ray in two, but the blast's scorching heat still washed over him, scorching his armor. If not for the strength of his divine equipment, he would be blistered and burned beyond recognition. "What?" Busby's eyes widened in genuine surprise. He hadn't expected this god of destruction to possess such raw potential and unbreakable will to survive. For a heartbeat, his confidence wavered. Then a deeper, more dangerous smile curved his lips. "It seems I underestimated you, Ethan," he said, voice silky with amusement. "But that only makes our next round far more entertaining." Finger of Fire, double blades. Without hesitation, Basby shot out 2 fingertips toward Ethan. Flames roared to life around his fingers, coalescing into twin, blade-shaped torrents of fire that streaked across the clearing. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as the scorch, knives of flame bore down on him. His pupils contracted into pinpricks. Death felt closer than ever. Chapter 801, Yumichika Ayasagawa draws his sword. Life and death hovered over Yumichikawa in that instant, sharpening his senses to a razor's edge. He felt every heartbeat as a reminder of existence's fragility and its stubborn will to endure. Death, once a distant abstraction, now lurked at his side like a shadow poised to strike. He inhaled deeply, fueling himself with equal parts fear and determination. In his hand, the soul blade was more than steel. It was an extension of his very being, the outward manifestation of his spirit. With sudden clarity, he fixed his gaze ahead. One hand clasped the hilt, the other palm pressed against the blade itself, using his hand as a sheath. Around him, the world slowed, colors dimmed, and motion stuttered to a crawl. Only he and the blade remained vivid and alive. "Draw the sword," he roared. At once, the weapon in his grip transformed. The glazed peacock awakened like a mythic phoenix, its feathers of light unfurling in a burst of brilliance that chased away the gathering gloom. The blade glowed with an otherworldly light, suffused with immense spiritual pressure and raw destructive force. It tore at the surrounding air as though it were paper, each vibration resonating with power. Forged from the very essence of the soul, this double-edged saber, known as glass-colored peacock, was both stunning and deadly. Along its glassy steel, a shimmering radiance undulated like a peacock unfurling its iridescent plumage at dawn, beautiful, mesmerizing, and utterly lethal. Yet this brilliance was more than mere spectacle. It could rend flesh and spirit alike, converting its wielder's own spiritual energy into a subtle, all-consuming weapon beyond the logic of ordinary combat. "Glass-colored peacock!" Ethan shouted, planting his feet against Basby's surging onslaught. He refused to falter. In a single, fluid motion, he swept the blade in a wide arc, and 2 razor-sharp trails of glass-like light sprang forth. They intertwined in midair like the splendid feathers of a peacock in full display, cleaving Basby's attack to fragments before it could reach him. It wasn't a mere cut. Ethan's strike had shattered the very structure of Basby's spirit particles, snuffing out the chain reaction in an instant. Basby's face went ashen. His eyes widened in disbelief as he stared at the barely noticeable wound. He'd never expected his attack to be undone so effortlessly, let alone by someone he'd so casually dismissed. Ethan, formerly known as Luther, slowly sheathed his soul blade. The destructive force that had coursed through the weapon still thrummed in his arm, and a thrill of satisfaction welled up inside him. "So this is what it feels like to become a god of destruction," he whispered, delighting in the raw power at his fingertips. He turned to Basby, a faint, confident smile lifting the corners of his mouth. "Quincy, are you ready for round 2? Madness and unwillingness warred across Basby's features. He couldn't accept being conquered so completely by the one opponent he'd once considered beneath him. But Ethan's expression never wavered. To him, the heart-pounding exchange they just shared was nothing more than another day's training, and he was just getting started. Basby's voice rang out over the empty battlefield, each word laced with defiance and disbelief. He launched himself forward with a Fei Lian kick, the ground shuddering beneath his furious strides as clouds of dust trailed at his heels. What he didn't know was that Ethan had changed, become something far more formidable than the boy he once was. With a crisp whisper of steel, Ethan swung his blade, glass peacock, through the air. In an instant, it split into 2 searing arcs of light that struck Basby dead center. The impact was blindingly fast and twice as powerful as before. Time seemed to slow as Basby's body jerked to a halt in midair. Then, as though slammed by a titanic hammer, he was sent careening backward, crashing into the earth in a plume of dust and debris. He tried to rise, but his limbs felt crust, head under an invisible weight. He coughed, choking on dirt, eyes wide with shock. How is this possible? He managed to gasp, voice trembling more from incredulity than pain. He had never imagined such a decisive defeat, not in 1,000 battles. He looked up, panic and disbelief warring in his gaze, as Ethan advanced at a steady, unhurried pace. Each of Ethan's steps hit the ground like a thunderclap, driving the realization further home. This fight was over, and the predator had become prey. He halted before Basby, his gaze calm and unflinching. "It seems I still overestimated you, Ethan." Yumichika Ayasegawa watched impassively, the faintest smirk playing at his lips. "Is that so?" Refusing to concede, Basby let out a furious roar. He sprang to his feet and thrust his palm forward toward Yumichika. From his hand erupted 5 seething vortices of flame, each one whirling with devastating force and intolerable heat. The air trembled with a thunderous boom as the fireballs collided with the battlefield, sparks racing outward like lethal fireworks. Basby's allies recoiled, stumbling back from the blistering inferno that threatened to engulf them. Collapsed on the scorched earth, Basby laughed triumphantly. "I've won, god of destruction." But his laughter sputtered and died when a figure slowly materialized from the center of the conflagration. As the flames parted, there stood Ayasegawa Yumichika, completely unharmed, every thread of his uniform intact, not a hair out of place. Ethan still gripped the glass peacock, his expression calm and unruffled, as though the massive blast a moment ago hadn't even touched him. A destructive force strong enough to shatter spirit particles had barely slowed him. He looked down coolly at Basby and called out, "Is that it? I suppose I still overestimated you, Quincy. God of destruction, don't get too full of yourself." Basby's face went pale, veins bulging in his temple. He hadn't expected to lose to someone he'd always considered an ant. With a roar of frustration, he thrust out his right hand, igniting it in roaring flames that coalesced into a blazing sword. Flame Finger, Level 4. In his hand, Basby's infernal blade crackled. In Ethan's, the delicate yet deadly glass peacock gleamed. The two charged, colliding at the center of the courtyard with a thunderous clang. Fire and spirit light twisted around each other, sending shockwaves that rattled the stones beneath their feet. Ethan met Basby's assault with a serene smile. He lifted the glass peacock, its translucent steel slicing through the searing heat of the flaming sword. The blades locked, sparks and embers dancing in the air. Then, at Ethan's slightest shift of weight, the glass peacock flashed free. In a single, graceful arc, Ethan's blade severed Basby's head from his shoulders. Basby's scream cut off abruptly. As his body crumpled to the ground, Ethan stood motionless, the glass peacock still streaked with light. Not a hair on his head was out of place, and not a trace of doubt lingered in his steady gaze, only the icy certainty of victory.